Section 1 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsten Ferrari. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 1, Chapters 1 through 3. Book the First. Sewing. Chapter 1. The One Thing Needful. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else, and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of service to them. This is the principle upon which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle upon which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom, and the speaker's square forefinger emphasized his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line on the schoolmaster's sleeve. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's square wall of a forehead, which had his eyebrows for its base, while his eyes found commodious cellarage in two dark caves, overshadowed by the wall. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's mouth, which was wide, thin, and hard-set. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's voice, which was inflexible, dry, and dictatorial. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's hair, which bristled on the skirts of his bald head, a plantation of furs to keep the wind from its shining surface, all covered with knobs like the crust of a plum pie, as if the head had scarcely warehouse room for the hard facts stored inside. The speaker's obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, nay, his very neckcloth, trained to take him by the throat with an unaccommodating grasp, like a stubborn fact, as it was, all helped the emphasis. In this life we want nothing but facts, sir, nothing but facts. The speaker, and the schoolmaster, and the third grown person present all backed a little, and swept with their eyes the inclined plane of little vessels then and there arranged in order, ready to have imperial gallons of facts poured into them until they were full to the brim. Chapter 2. Murdering the Innocents. Thomas Gradgrind, sir. A man of realities. A man of facts and calculations, a man who proceeds upon the principle that 2 and 2 are 4 and nothing over, and who is not to be talked into allowing for anything over. Thomas Gradgrind, sir, peremptorily Thomas Gradgrind, with a rule and a pair of scales and the multiplication table always in his pocket, sir, ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature, and tell you exactly what it comes to. It is a mere question of figures, a case of simple arithmetic. You might hope to get some other nonsensical belief into the head of George Gradgrind, or Augustus Gradgrind, or John Gradgrind, or Joseph Gradgrind, all supposititious, non-existent persons. But into the head of Thomas Gradgrind? No, sir. In such terms Mr. Gradgrind always mentally introduced himself, whether to his private circle of acquaintance, or to the public in general. In such terms, no doubt, substituting the words boys and girls for sir, Thomas Gradgrind now presented Thomas Gradgrind to the little pitchers before him, who were to be filled so full of facts. Indeed, as he easily sparkled at them from the cellarage before mentioned, he seemed a kind of cannon loaded to the muzzle with facts, and prepared to blow them clean out of the regions of childhood at one discharge. He seemed a galvanizing apparatus, too, charged with a grim mechanical substitute for the tender young imaginations that were to be stormed away. "Girl number 20, said Mr. Gradgrind, squarely pointing his square forefinger. "I don't know that girl. Who is that girl?" "Sissy Jupe, sir," explained number 20, blushing, standing up, and curtsying. "Sissy is not a name," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Don't call yourself Sissy. Call yourself Cecilia." "It's father as calls me Sissy, sir," returned the young girl in a trembling voice, and with another curtsy. "Then he has no business to do it," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Tell him he mustn't. Cecilia Jupe. Let me see, what is your father?" "He belongs to the horse-riding, if you please, sir." Mr. Gradgrind frowned, and waved off the objectionable calling with his hand. "We don't want to know anything about that here. You mustn't tell us about that here. Your father breaks horses, don't he?" "If you please, sir, when they can get any to break, they do break horses in the ring." "You mustn't tell us about the ring here. Very well, then. Describe your father as a horsebreaker. He doctors sick horses, I dare say." "Oh, yes, sir." "Very well, then. He is a veterinary surgeon, a farrier, and a horsebreaker. Give me a definition of a horse." Sissy Jupe thrown into greatest alarm by this demand. "Girl number 20 unable to define a horse," said Mr. Gradgrind, for the general behoof of all the little pitchers. "Girl number 20 possessed of no facts in reference to one of the commonest of animals. Some boy's definition of a horse. Bitzer, yours." The square finger, moving here and there, lighted suddenly on Bitzer, perhaps because he chanced to sit in the same ray of sunlight which, darting in at one of the bare windows of the intensely whitewashed room, irradiated Sissy. For the boys and girls sat on the face of the inclined plane in two compact bodies, divided up the centre by a narrow interval, and Sissy, being at the corner of a row on the sunny side, came in for the beginning of a sunbeam, of which Bitzer, being at the corner of a row on the other side, a few rows in advance, caught on the end. But, whereas the girl was so dark-eyed and dark-haired that she seemed to receive a deeper and more lustrous colour from the sun when it shone upon her, the boy was so light-eyed and light-haired that the selfsame rays appeared to draw out of him what little colour he ever possessed. His cold eyes would hardly have been eyes but for the short ends of lashes which, by bringing them into immediate contrast with something paler than themselves, expressed their form. His short cropped hair might have been a mere continuation of the sandy freckles on his forehead and face. His skin was so unwholesomely deficient in the natural tinge that he looked as though, if he were cut, he would bleed white. "Bitzer," said Thomas Gradgrind, "your definition of a horse." "Quadruped, graminivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, and 12 incisive. Sheds coat in spring, in marshy country, sheds hoofs too. Hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with iron. Age known by marks in mouth." Thus, and much more, Bitzer. "Now, girl number 20, said Mr. Gradgrind, "you know what a horse is." She curtsied again, and would have blushed deeper if she could have blushed deeper than she had blushed all this time. Bitzer, after rapidly blinking at Thomas Gradgrind with both eyes at once, and so catching the light upon his quivering ends of lashes that they looked like the antennae of busy insects, put his knuckles to his freckled forehead, and sat down again. The third gentleman now stepped forth. A mighty man at cutting and drying he was, a government officer, in his way, and in most other people's too, a professed pugilist, always in training, always with a system to force down the general throat like a bolus, always to be heard of at the bar of his little public office, ready to fight all England. To continue in fistic phraseology, he had a genius for coming up to the scratch wherever and whatever it was, and proving himself an ugly customer. He would go in and damage any subject whatever with his right, follow with his left, stop, exchange, counter, bore his opponent (he always fought all England) to the ropes, and fall upon him neatly. He was certain to knock the wind out of common sense, and render that unlucky adversary deaf to the call of time. And he had it in charge from high authority to bring about the great public office millennium, when commissioners should reign upon earth. "Very well," said this gentleman, briskly smiling and folding his arms. "That's a horse. Now let me ask you, boys and girls, would you paper a room with representations of horses?" After a pause, one half of the children cried out in chorus, "Yes, sir." Upon which the other half, seeing in the gentleman's face that yes was wrong, cried out in chorus, "No, sir," as the custom is in these examinations. "Of course no. Why wouldn't you?" A pause. One corpulent, slow boy, with a wheezy manner of breathing, ventured the answer, "Because he wouldn't paper a room at all, but would paint it." "You must paper it," said the gentleman, rather warmly. "You must paper it," said Thomas Gradgrind, "whether you like it or not. Don't tell us you wouldn't paper it. What do you mean, boy?" "I'll explain to you, then," said the gentleman, after another and dismal pause. "Why wouldn't you paper a room with representations of horses? Do you ever see horses walking up and down the sides of rooms in reality, in fact? Do you?" "Yes, sir," from one half. "No, sir," from the other. "Of course no," said the gentleman, with an indignant look at the wrong half. "Why, then, you are not to see anywhere what you don't see in fact. You are not to have anywhere what you don't have in fact. What is called taste is only another name for fact." Thomas Gradgrind nodded his approbation. "This is a new principle, a discovery, a great discovery," said the gentleman. "Now I'll try you again. Suppose you were going to carpet a room. Would you use a carpet having a representation of flowers upon it?" There being a general conviction by this time that "No, sir," was always the right answer to this gentleman, the chorus of "No" was very strong. Only a few feeble stragglers said yes, among them Sissy Jupe. "Girl number 20," said the gentleman, smiling in the calm strength of knowledge. Sissy blushed and stood up. "So you would carpet your room, or your husband's room, if you were a grown woman and had a husband, with representations of flowers, would you?" said the gentleman. "Why would you?" "If you please, sir, I am very fond of flowers," returned the girl. "And is that why you would put tables and chairs upon them, and have people walking over them with heavy boots?" "It wouldn't hurt them, sir. They wouldn't crush and wither, if you please, sir. They would be pictures of what was very pretty and pleasant, and I would fancy—" "Ay, ay, but you mustn't fancy," cried the gentleman, quite elated by coming so happily to his point. "That's it, you are never to fancy." "You are not, Cecilia Jupe," Thomas Gradgrind solemnly repeated, "to do anything of that kind." "Fact, fact," said the gentleman, and "fact, fact," repeated Thomas Gradgrind. "You are to be in all things regulated and governed," said the gentleman, "by fact. We hope to have, before long, a board of fact, composed of commissioners of fact, who will force the people to be a people of fact, and of nothing but fact. You must discard the word fancy altogether. You have nothing to do with it. You are not to have, in any object of use or ornament, what would be a contradiction in fact. You don't walk upon flowers in fact. You cannot be allowed to walk upon flowers in carpets. You don't find that foreign birds and butterflies come down and perch upon your crockery. You cannot be permitted to paint foreign birds and butterflies upon your crockery. You never meet with quadrupeds going up and down walls. You must not have quadrupeds represented upon walls. You must use," said the gentleman, "for all these purposes, combinations and modifications in primary colours of mathematical figures which are susceptible of proof and demonstration. This is the new discovery. This is fact. This is taste." The girl curtsied and sat down. She was very young, and she looked as if she were frightened by the matter-of-fact prospect the world afforded. "Now, if Mr. M'Choakumchild," said the gentleman, "will proceed to give his first lesson here, Mr. Gradgrind, I shall be happy, at your request, to observe his mode of procedure." Mr. Gradgrind was much obliged. "Mr. M'Choakumchild, we only wait for you." So Mr. M'Choakumchild began in his best manner. He and some 140 other schoolmasters had lately been turned at the same time in the same factory on the same principles, like so many pianoforte legs. He had been put through an immense variety of paces, and had answered volumes of head-breaking questions: orthography, etymology, syntax, and prosody, biography, astronomy, geography, and general cosmography, the sciences of compound proportion, algebra, land surveying and levelling, vocal music, and drawing from models, were all at the ends of his 10 chilled fingers. He had worked his stony way into Her Majesty's most honourable Privy Council's Schedule B, and had taken the bloom off the higher branches of mathematics and physical science, French, German, Latin, and Greek. He knew all about the watersheds of all the world, whatever they are, and all the histories of all the peoples, and all the names of all the rivers and mountains, and all the productions, manners, and customs of all the countries, and all their boundaries and bearings on the 32 points of the compass. Ah, rather overdone, Mr. M'Choakumchild. If he had only learnt a little less, how infinitely better he might have taught much more. He went to work in this preparatory lesson not unlike Morgiana in the 40 Thieves, looking into all the vessels ranged before him, one after another, to see what they contained. Say, good Mr. M'Choakumchild, when from thy boiling store thou shalt fill each jar-brim full by and by, dost thou think that thou wilt always kill outright the robber fancy lurking within, or sometimes only maim and distort him? Chapter 3. A Loophole. Mr. Gradgrind walked homeward from the school in a state of considerable satisfaction. It was his school, and he intended it to be a model. He intended every child in it to be a model, just as the young Gradgrinds were all models. There were 5 young Gradgrinds, and they were models every one. They had been lectured at from their tenderest years, coursed like little hares. Almost as soon as they could run alone, they had been made to run to the lecture-room. The first object with which they had an association, or of which they had a remembrance, was a large blackboard with a dry ogre chalking ghastly white figures on it. Not that they knew, by name or nature, anything about an ogre, fact forbid. I only use the word to express a monster in a lecturing castle. with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive and dragging it into gloomy statistical dens by the hair. No little Gradgrind had ever seen a face in the moon. It was up in the moon before it could speak distinctly. No little Gradgrind had ever learnt the silly jingle, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." No little Gradgrind had ever known wonder on the subject, each little Gradgrind having, at 5 years, dissected the Great Bear like a Professor Owen, and driven Charles's Wain like a locomotive engine driver. No little Gradgrind had ever associated a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn, who tossed the dog, who worried the cat, who killed the rat, who ate the malt, or with that yet more famous cow who swallowed Tom Thumb. It had never heard of these celebrities, and had only been introduced to a cow as a graminivorous ruminating quadruped with several stomachs. To his matter-of-fact home, which was called Stone Lodge, Mr. Gradgrind directed his steps. He had virtually retired from the wholesale hardware trade before he built Stone Lodge, and was now looking about for a suitable opportunity of making an arithmetical figure in Parliament. Stone Lodge was situated on a moor within a mile or two of a great town, called Coketown in the present faithful guide-book. A very regular feature on the face of the country, Stone Lodge was, not the least disguise toned down or shaded off that uncompromising fact in the landscape, a great square house, with a heavy portico darkening the principal windows, as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. A calculated, cast-up, balanced, and proved house. 6 windows on this side of the door, 6 on that side, a total of 12 in this wing, a total of 12 in the other wing, 4 and 20 carried over to the back wings. A lawn and garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account book. Gas and ventilation, drainage and water service, all of the primest quality. Iron clamps and girders, fireproof from top to bottom, mechanical lifts for the housemaids with all their brushes and brooms, everything that the heart could desire. Everything? Well, I suppose so. The little Gradgrinds had cabinets in various departments of science, too. They had a little conchological cabinet, and a little metallurgical cabinet, and a little mineralogical cabinet, and the specimens were all arranged and labelled, and the bits of stone and ore looked as though they might have been broken from the parent substances by those tremendously hard instruments, their own names, and to paraphrase the idle legend of Peter Piper, who had never found his way into their nursery, if the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at more than this, what was it, for good gracious goodness sake, that the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped it? Their father walked in on a hopeful and satisfied frame of mind. He was an affectionate father, after his manner, but he would probably have described himself, if he had been put, like Sissy Jupe, upon a definition, as an eminently practical father. He had a particular pride in the phrase eminently practical, which was considered to have a special application to him. Whatsoever the public meeting held in Coketown, and whatsoever the subject of such meeting, some Coketowner was sure to seize the occasion of alluding to his eminently practical friend, Gradgrind. This always pleased the eminently practical friend. He knew it to be his due, but his due was acceptable. He had reached the neutral ground upon the outskirts of the town, which was neither town nor country, and yet was either spoiled, when his ears were invaded by the sound of music. The clashing and banging band attached to the horse-riding establishment, which had there set up its rest in a wooden pavilion, was in full bray. A flag, floating from the summit of the temple, proclaimed to mankind that it was Sleary's horse-riding, which claimed their suffrages. Sleary himself, a stout modern statue with a money-box at its elbow, in an ecclesiastical niche of early Gothic architecture, took the money. Miss Josephine Sleary, as some very long and very narrow strips of printed bill announced, was then inaugurating the entertainment with her graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Among the other pleasing but always strictly moral wonders which must be seen to be believed, Signor Jupe was that afternoon to elucidate the diverting accomplishments of his highly trained performing dog Merryless. He was also to exhibit his astounding feat of throwing 75 hundredweight in rapid succession back-handed over his head, thus forming a fountain of solid iron in mid-air, a feat never before attempted in this or any other country, and which, having elicited such rapturous plaudits from enthusiastic throngs, it cannot be withdrawn. The same Signor Jupe was to enliven the varied performances at frequent intervals with his chaste Shakespearean quips and retorts. Lastly, he was to wind them up by appearing in his favourite character of Mr. William Button of Tooley Street in the highly novel and laughable hippocomedietta of The Tailor's Journey to Brentford. Thomas Gradgrind took no heed of these trivialities, of course, but passed on as a practical man ought to pass on, either brushing the noisy insects from his thoughts, or consigning them to the house of correction. But the turning of the road took him by the back of the booth, and at the back of the booth a number of children were congregated in a number of stealthy attitudes, striving to peep in at the hidden glories of this place. This brought him to a stop. "Now think of these vagabonds," said he, "attracting the young rabble from a model school." A space of stunted grass and dry rubbish being between him and the young rabble, he took his eyeglass out of his waistcoat to look for any child he knew by name, and might order off. Phenomenon almost incredible, though distinctly seen, what did he then behold but his own metallurgical Louisa, and his own mathematical Thomas, abasing himself on the ground to catch but a hoof of the graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Dumb with amazement, Mr. Gradgrind crossed to the spot where his family was thus disgraced, laid his hand upon each erring child, and said, "Louisa! Thomas!" Both rose, red and disconcerted. But Louisa looked at her father with more boldness than Thomas did. Indeed, Thomas did not look at him, but gave himself up to be taken home like a machine. "In the name of wonder, idleness, and folly," said Mr. Gradgrind, leading each away by a hand, "what do you do here?" "Wanted to see what it was like," returned Louisa shortly. "What it was like?" "Yes, father." There was an air of jaded sullenness in them both, and particularly in the girl, yet, struggling through the dissatisfaction of her face, there was a light with nothing to rest upon, a fire with nothing to burn, a starved imagination keeping life in itself somehow, which brightened its expression, not with the brightness natural to cheerful youth, but with uncertain, eager, doubtful flashes, which had something painful in them, analogous to the changes on a blind face groping its way. She was a child now of 15 or 16, but at no distant day would seem to become a woman all at once. Her father thought so as he looked at her. She was pretty, would have been self-willed, he thought in his eminently practical way, but for her bringing up. "Thomas, though I have the fact before me, I find it difficult to believe that you, with your education and resources, should have brought your sister to a scene like this." "I brought him, father," said Louisa, quickly. "I asked him to come." "I'm sorry to hear it. I am very sorry to hear it. It makes Thomas no better, and it makes you worse, Louisa." She looked at her father again, but no tear fell down her cheek. "You, Thomas, and you, to whom the circle of the sciences is open. Thomas and you, who may be said to be replete with facts. Thomas and you, who have been trained to mathematical exactness. Thomas and you here," cried Mr. Gradgrind, "in this degraded position. I am amazed." "I was tired, father. I've been tired a long time," said Louisa. "Tired? Of what?" asked the astonished father. "I don't know of what. Of everything, I think." "Say not another word," returned Mr. Gradgrind. "You are childish. I will hear no more." He did not speak again until they had walked some half a mile in silence, when he gravely broke out with, "What would your best friends say, Louisa? Do you attach no value to their good opinion? What would Mr. Bounderby say?" At the mention of this name his daughter stole a look at him, remarkable for its intense and searching character. He saw nothing of it, for before he looked at her she had again cast down her eyes. "What," he repeated presently, "would Mr. Bounderby say?" All the way to Stone Lodge, as with grave indignation he led the two delinquents home, he repeated at intervals, "What would Mr. Bounderby say?" as if Mr. Bounderby had been Mrs. Grundy. End of section 1.
Section 2 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stuart Wills. Hard Times by Charles Dickens, Section 2. Book 1, Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4. Mr. Bounderby. Not being Mrs. Grundy, who was Mr. Bounderby? Why, Mr. Bounderby was as near to being Mr. Gradgrind's bosom friend as a man perfectly devoid of sentiment can approach that spiritual relationship towards another man perfectly devoid of sentiment. So near was Mr. Bounderby, or, if the reader should prefer it, so far off. He was a rich man, banker, merchant, manufacturer, and what not. A big, loud man with a stare and a metallic laugh. A man made out of a coarse material, which seemed to have been stretched to make so much of him. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon and ready to start. A man who could never sufficiently vaunt himself a self-made man, a man who was always proclaiming through that brassy speaking trumpet voice of his old ignorance and his old poverty. A man who was the bully of humility. A year or two younger than his eminently practical friend, Mr. Bounderby looked older. His 7 or 8 and 40 might have had the 7 or 8 added to it again without surprising anybody. He had not much hair. One might have fancied he had talked it off, and that what was left, all standing up in disorder, was in that condition from being constantly blown about by his windy boastfulness. In the formal drawing-room of Stone Lodge, standing on the hearthrug, warming himself before the fire, Mr. Bounderby delivered some observations to Mrs. Gradgrind on the circumstance of its being his birthday. He stood before the fire, partly because it was a cool spring afternoon, though the sun shone, partly because the shade of Stone Lodge was always haunted by the ghost of damp mortar, partly because he thus took up a commanding position from which to subdue Mrs. Gradgrind.
I hadn't a shoe on my foot. As to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch, and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch.
Mrs. Gradgrind, a little thin, white, pink-eyed bundle of shawls, of surpassing feebleness mental and bodily, who was always taking physic without any effect, and who, whenever she showed a symptom of coming to life, was invariably stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling on her. Mrs. Gradgrind hoped it was a dry ditch.
No, wet as a sop, a foot of water in it,
said Mr. Bounderby. Enough to give a baby cold, Mrs. Gradgrind considered.
Cold? I was born with inflammation of the lungs, and of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation,
returned Mr. Bounderby.
For years, madam, I was one of the most miserable little wretches ever seen. I was so sickly that I was always moaning and groaning. I was so ragged and dirty that you wouldn't have touched me with a pair of tongs.
Mrs. Gradgrind faintly looked at the tongs as the most appropriate thing her imbecility could think of doing.
How I fought through it I don't know, said Bounderby. I was determined, I suppose. I have been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then. Here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and nobody to thank for being here but myself.
Mrs. Gradgrind meekly and weakly hoped that his mother...
My mother bolted, ma'am, said Bounderby.
Mrs. Gradgrind, stunned as usual, collapsed, and gave it up.
My mother left me to my grandmother, said Bounderby, and according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and worst old woman that ever lived. If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she would take 'em off and sell 'em for drink. Why, I have known that grandmother of mine lie in her bed and drink her 14 glasses of liquor before breakfast.
Mrs. Gradgrind, weakly smiling, and giving no other sign of vitality, looked, as she always did, like an indifferently executed transparency of a small female figure, without enough light behind it.
She kept a chandler's shop, pursued Bounderby, and kept me in an egg box. That was the cot of my infancy, an old egg box. As soon as I was big enough to run away, of course I ran away. Then I became a young vagabond, and instead of one old woman knocking me about and starving me, everybody of all ages knocked me about and starved me. They were right. They had no business to do anything else. I was a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest. I know that very well.
His pride in having at any time of his life achieved such a great social distinction as to be a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest, was only to be satisfied by 3 sonorous repetitions of the boast.
I was to pull through it, I suppose, Mrs. Gradgrind. Whether I was to do it or not, ma'am, I did it. I pulled through it, though nobody threw me out a rope. Vagabond, errand boy, vagabond, labourer, porter, clerk, chief manager, small partner, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Those are the antecedents and the culmination. Josiah Bounderby of Coketown learnt his letters from the outsides of shops, Mrs. Gradgrind, and was first able to tell the time upon a dial plate from studying the steeple clock of St. Giles Church, London, under the direction of a drunken cripple, who was a convicted thief and an incorrigible vagrant. Tell Josiah Bounderby of Coketown of your district schools, and your model schools, and your training schools, and your whole kettle of fish schools, and Josiah Bounderby of Coketown tells you plainly, all right, all correct, he hadn't such advantages, but let us have hard-headed, solid-fisted people. The education that made him won't do for everybody, he knows well. Such and such his education was, however, and you may force him to swallow boiling fat, but you shall never force him to suppress the facts of his life.
Being heated when he arrived at this climax, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown stopped. He stopped just as his eminently practical friend, still accompanied by the 2 young culprits, entered the room. His eminently practical friend, on seeing him, stopped also and gave Louisa a reproachful look that plainly said, "Behold your Bounderby."
Well, blustered Mr. Bounderby, what's the matter? What is young Thomas in the dumps about?
He spoke of young Thomas, but he looked at Louisa. "We were peeping at the circus," muttered Louisa haughtily, without lifting up her eyes, "and father caught us." "And, Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband in a lofty manner, "I should as soon have expected to find my children reading poetry." "Dear me," whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, "how can you, Louisa and Thomas? I wonder at you. I declare you're enough to make one regret ever having had a family at all. I have a great mind to say I wish I hadn't. Then what would you have done, I should like to know?" Mr. Gradgrind did not seem favourably impressed by these cogent remarks. He frowned impatiently. "As if, with my head in its present throbbing state, you couldn't go and look at the shells and minerals and things provided for you, instead of circuses," said Mrs. Gradgrind. "You know as well as I do, no young people have circus masters, or keep circuses in cabinets, or attend lectures about circuses. What can you possibly want to know of circuses, then? I am sure you have enough to do, if that's what you want. With my head in its present state, I couldn't remember the mere names of half the facts you have got to attend to." "That's the reason," pouted Louisa. "Don't tell me the reason, because it can't be nothing of the sort," said Mrs. Gradgrind. "Go and be something illogical directly." Mrs. Gradgrind was not a scientific character, and usually dismissed her children to their studies with this general injunction to choose their pursuit. In truth, Mrs. Gradgrind's stock of facts in general was woefully defective, but Mr. Gradgrind, in raising her to her high matrimonial position, had been influenced by 2 reasons. Firstly, she was most satisfactory as a question of figures, and secondly, she had no nonsense about her. By nonsense he meant fancy, and truly it is probable she was as free from any alloy of that nature as any human being not arrived at the perfection of an absolute idiot ever was. The simple circumstance of being left alone with her husband and Mr. Bounderby was sufficient to stun this admirable lady again without collision between herself and any other fact. So she once more died away, and nobody minded her. "Bounderby," said Mr. Gradgrind, drawing a chair to the fireside, You are always so interested in my young people, particularly in Louisa, that I make no apology for saying to you I am very much vexed by this discovery. I have systematically devoted myself, as you know, to the education of the reason of my family. The reason is, as you know, the only faculty to which the education should be addressed. And yet, Bounderby, it would appear from this unexpected circumstance of to-day, though in itself a trifling one, as if something had crept into Thomas's and Louisa's minds, which is, or rather which is not, I do not know that I can express myself better than by saying, which has never been intended to be developed, and in which their reason has no part.
There certainly is no reason in looking with interest at a parcel of vagabonds, returned Bounderby. When I was a vagabond myself, nobody looked with any interest at me, I know that.
Then comes the question, said the eminently practical father, with his eyes on the fire. In what has this vulgar curiosity its rise?
I'll tell you in what. In idle imagination.
I hope not, said the eminently practical. I confess, however, that the misgiving has crossed me on my way home.
In idle imagination, Gradgrind, repeated Bounderby. A very bad thing for anybody, but a cursed bad thing for a girl like Louisa. I should ask Mrs. Gradgrind's pardon for strong expressions, but that she knows very well I am not a refined character. Whoever expects refinement in me will be disappointed. I hadn't a refined bringing up.
Whether, said Gradgrind, pondering with his hands in his pockets and his cavernous eyes on the fire, whether any instructor or servant can have suggested anything, whether Louisa or Thomas can have been reading anything, whether, in spite of all precautions, any idle story-book can have got into the house, because in minds that have been practically formed by rule and line from the cradle upwards, this is so curious, so incomprehensible.
Stop a bit,
cried Bounderby, who all this time had been standing, as before, on the hearth, bursting at the very furniture of the room with explosive humility.
You have one of those strollers' children in the school.
Cecilia Jupe by name, said Mr. Gradgrind, with something of a stricken look at his friend.
Now stop a bit, cried Bounderby again. How did she come there?
Why, the fact is, I saw the girl myself, for the first time only just now. She specially applied here at the house to be admitted, as not regularly belonging to our town. And, yes, you are right, Bounderby, you are right.
Now stop a bit, cried Bounderby once more. Louisa saw her when she came.
Louisa certainly did see her, for she mentioned the application to me. But Louisa saw her, I have no doubt, in Mrs. Gradgrind's presence.
Pray, Mrs. Gradgrind, said Bounderby, what passed?
Oh, my poor health, returned Mrs. Gradgrind. The girl wanted to come to the school, and Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come to the school, and Louisa and Thomas both said that the girl wanted to come, and that Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come, and how was it possible to contradict them when such was the fact?
Now I tell you what, Gradgrind, said Mr. Bounderby, turn this girl to the right about, and there's an end of it.
I am much of your opinion.
Do it at once, said Bounderby. Has always been my motto from a child. When I thought I would run away from my egg-box and my grandmother, I did it at once. Do you the same. Do this at once.
Are you walking? Asked his friend. I have the father's address. Perhaps he would not mind walking to town with me.
Not the least in the world, said Mr. Bounderby, as long as you do it at once.
So Mr. Bounderby threw on his hat. He always threw it on, as expressing a man who had been far too busily employed in making himself to acquire any fashion of wearing his hat, and with his hands in his pockets, sauntered out into the hall.
I never wear gloves, it was his custom to say. I didn't climb up the ladder in them. Shouldn't be so high up if I had.
Being left to saunter in the hall a minute or two while Mr. Gradgrind went upstairs for the address, He opened the door of the children's study, and looked into that serene floor-clothed apartment, which, notwithstanding its bookcases and its cabinets and its variety of learned and philosophical appliances, had much of the genial aspect of a room devoted to hair-cutting. Louisa languidly leaned upon the window looking out, without looking at anything, while young Thomas stood sniffing revengefully at the fire. Adam Smith and Malthus, two younger Gradgrinds, were out at lecture in custody, and little Jane, after manufacturing a good deal of moist pipe clay on her face with slate pencil and tears, had fallen asleep over vulgar fractions.
"It's all right now, Louisa. It's all right, young Thomas," said Mr. Bounderby. "You won't do so any more. I'll answer for its being all over with father. Well, Louisa, that's worth a kiss, isn't it?"
"You can take one, Mr. Bounderby," returned Louisa, when she had coldly paused, and slowly walked across the room, and ungraciously raised her cheek towards him, with her face turned away.
"Always my pet, ain't you, Louisa?" said Mr. Bounderby. "Good-bye, Louisa."
He went his way, but she stood on the same spot, rubbing the cheek he had kissed with her handkerchief until it was burning red. She was doing this 5 minutes afterwards. "What are you about, Lou?" her brother sulkily remonstrated. "You'll rub a hole in your face." "You may cut the piece out with your penknife if you like, Tom. I wouldn't cry." Chapter 5. The Keynote. Coketown, to which Messrs. Bounderby and Gradgrind now walked, was a triumph of fact. It had no greater taint of fancy in it than Mrs. Gradgrind herself. Let us strike the keynote, Coketown, before pursuing our tune. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam-engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets, still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. These attributes of Coketown were in the main inseparable from the work by which it was sustained. Against them were to be set off comforts of life which found their way all over the world, and elegancies of life which made, we will not ask how much of the fine lady, who could scarcely bear to hear the place mentioned. The rest of its features were voluntary, and they were these. You saw nothing in Coketown but what was severely workful. If the members of a religious persuasion built a chapel there, as the members of 18 religious persuasions had done, they made it a pious warehouse of red brick, with sometimes, but this is only in highly ornamental examples, a bell in a bird cage on the top of it. The solitary exception was the new church, a stuccoed edifice with a square steeple over the door, terminating in 4 short pinnacles like florid wooden legs. All the public inscriptions in the town were painted alike, in severe characters of black and white. The jail might have been the infirmary might have been the jail, the town hall might have been either or both, or anything else, for anything that appeared to the contrary in the graces of their construction. Fact, 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 everywhere in the material aspect of the town. Fact, 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 everywhere in the immaterial. The Machocumchilde school was all fact, and the school of design was all fact, and the relations between master and man were all fact, and everything was fact between the lying-in hospital and the cemetery, and what you couldn't state in figures or show to be purchasable in the cheapest market and saleable in the dearest, was not, and never should be, world without end, amen. A town so sacred to fact and so triumphant in its assertion, of course got on well. Why, no, not quite well. No, dear me. No. Coketown did not come out of its own furnaces in all respects like gold that had stood the fire. First, the perplexing mystery of the place was, who belonged to the 18 denominations? Because whoever did, the laboring people did not. It was very strange to walk through the streets on a Sunday morning and note how few of them the barbarous jangling of bells that was driving the sick and nervous mad called away from their own quarter, from their own close rooms, from the corners of their own streets, where they lounged listlessly, gazing at all the church and chapel going, as at a thing with which they had no manner of concern. Nor was it merely the stranger who noticed this, because there was a native organization in Coketown itself, whose members were to be heard of in the House of Commons every session, indignantly petitioning for Acts of Parliament that should make these people religious by main force. Then came the Teetotal Society, who complained that these same people would get drunk, and showed in tabular statements that they did get drunk, and proved at tea parties that no inducement, human or divine, except a medal, would induce them to forego their custom of getting drunk. Then came the chemist and druggist with other tabular statements, showing that when they didn't get drunk they took opium. Then came the experienced chaplain of the jail, with more tabular statements, outdoing all the previous tabular statements, and showing that the same people would resort to low haunts hidden from the public eye, where they heard low singing and saw low dancing, and mayhap joined in it, and where A. B., aged 24 next birthday, and committed for 18 months solitary, had himself said, not that he had ever shown himself particularly worthy of belief, his ruin began, as he was perfectly sure and confident that otherwise he would have been a tip-top moral specimen. Then came Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby, the two gentlemen at this present moment walking through Coketown, and both eminently practical, who could on occasion furnish more tabular statements derived from their own personal experience, and illustrated by cases they had known and seen, from which it clearly appeared, in short it was the only clear thing in the case, that these same people were a bad lot altogether, gentlemen. That do what you would for them, they were never thankful for it, gentlemen. That they were restless, gentlemen. That they never knew what they wanted. That they lived upon the best, and bought fresh butter, and insisted on Mocha coffee, and rejected all but prime parts of meat, and yet were eternally dissatisfied and unmanageable. In short, it was the moral of the old nursery fable. There was an old woman, and what do you think? She lived upon nothing but victuals and drink. Victuals and drink were the whole of her diet, and yet this old woman would never be quiet. Is it possible, I wonder, that there was any analogy between the case of the Coketown population and the case of the little Gradgrinds? Surely none of us in our sober senses and acquainted with figures are to be told at this time of day that one of the foremost elements in the existence of the Coketown working people had been for scores of years deliberately set at naught; that there was any fancy in them demanding to be brought into healthy existence instead of struggling on in convulsions; that exactly in the ratio as they worked long and monotonously, the craving grew within them for some physical relief, some relaxation, encouraging good humor and good spirits, and giving them a vent; some recognized holiday, though it were but for an honest dance to a stirring band of music; some occasional light pie in which even M'Choakumchild had no finger; which craving must and would be satisfied aright, or must and would inevitably go wrong, until the laws of creation were repealed. "This man lives at Pod's End, and I don't quite know Pod's End," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Which is it, Bounderby?" Mr. Bounderby knew it was somewhere downtown, but knew no more respecting it, and so they stopped for a moment, looking about. Almost as they did so, there came running around the corner of the street, at a quick pace and with a frightened look, a girl whom Mr. Gradgrind recognized. "Hallo!" said he. "Stop! Where are you going? Stop!" Girl number 20 stopped then, palpitating, and made him a curtsy. "Why are you tearing about the streets," said Mr. Gradgrind, "in this improper manner?"
I was run after, sir," the girl panted, "and I wanted to get away."
"Run after?" repeated Mr. Gradgrind. "Who would run after you?" The question was unexpectedly and suddenly answered for her, by the colourless boy, Bitzer, who came round the corner with such blind speed, and so little anticipating a stoppage on the pavement, that he brought himself up against Mr. Gradgrind's waistcoat, and rebounded into the road. "What do you mean, boy?" said Mr. Gradgrind. "What are you doing? How dare you dash against everybody in this manner?" Bitzer picked up his cap, which the concussion had knocked off, and backing and knuckling his forehead, pleaded that it was an accident. "Was this boy running after you, Jupe?" asked Mr. Gradgrind.
"Yes, sir,"
said the girl reluctantly.
"No, I wasn't, sir," cried Bitzer, "not till she run away from me. But the horse riders never mind what they say, sir. They're famous for it. You know the horse riders are famous for never minding what they say," addressing Sissy. "It's as well known in the town as, please sir, as the multiplication table isn't known to the horse riders."
Bitzer tried Mr. Bounderby with this.
"He frightens me so," said the girl, "with his cruel faces."
"Oh!" cried Bitzer.
"Oh, ain't you one of the rest? Ain't you a horse rider? I never looked at her, sir. I asked her if she would know how to define a horse to-morrow, and offered to tell her again, and she ran away, and I ran after her, sir, that she might know how to answer when she was asked. You wouldn't have thought of saying such mischief if you hadn't been a horse rider." "Her calling seems to be pretty well known among 'em," observed Mr. Bounderby. "You'd have had the whole school peeping in a row in a week."
"Truly, I think so," returned his friend. "Bitzer, turn you about and take yourself home. Jupe, stay here a moment. Let me hear of your running in this manner any more, boy, and you will hear of me through the master of the school. You understand what I mean. Go along." The boy stopped in his rapid blinking, knuckled his forehead again, glanced at Sissy, turned about, and retreated. "Now, girl," said Mr. Gradgrind, "take this gentleman and me to your father's. We are going there. What have you got in that bottle you're carrying?"
"Gin," said Mr. Bounderby.
"Dear no, sir. It's the 9 oils."
"The what?" cried Mr. Bounderby.
"The 9 oils, sir, to rub father with."
"Then," said Mr. Bounderby, with a short loud laugh, "what in the devil do you rub your father with 9 oils for?"
"It's what our people always use, sir, when they get any hurts in the ring," replied the girl, looking over her shoulder, to assure herself that her pursuer was gone. "They bruise themselves very bad sometimes."
"Serves 'em right," said Mr. Bounderby, "for being idle."
She glanced up at his face with mingled astonishment and dread.
"By George," said Mr. Bounderby, "when I was 4 or 5 years younger than you, I had worse bruises upon me than 10 oils, 20 oils, 40 oils would have rubbed off. I didn't get 'em by posture making, but by being banged about. There was no rope dancing for me. I danced on the bare ground, and was larruped with the rope."
Mr. Gradgrind, though hard enough, was by no means so rough a man as Mr. Bounderby. His character was not unkind, all things considered. It might have been a very kind one indeed, if he had only made some round mistake in the arithmetic that balanced it, years ago. He said, in what he meant for a reassuring tone, as they turned down a narrow road, "And this is Pod's End, is it, Jupe?"
"This it is, sir, and if you wouldn't mind, sir, this is the house."
She stopped, at twilight, at the door of a mean little public house, with dim red lights in it, As haggard and as shabby as if, for want of custom, it had itself taken to drinking, and had gone the way all drunkards go, and was very near the end of it.
"It's only crossing the bar, sir, and up the stairs, if you wouldn't mind, and waiting there for a moment till I get a candle. If you should hear a dog, sir, it's only Merrylegs, and he only barks." "Merrylegs and 9 oils, eh?"
said Mr. Bounderby, entering last with his metallic laugh.
"Pretty well this for a self-made man."
End of section 2.
Section 3 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Wills. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 3, Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Sleary's Horsemanship. The name of the public house was the Pegasus Arms. The Pegasus Legs might have been more to the purpose, but underneath the winged horse upon the sideboard, the Pegasus Arms was inscribed in Roman letters. Beneath that inscription again, in a flowing scroll, the painter had touched off the lines, "Good malt makes good beer, walk in and they'll draw it here. Good wine makes good brandy, give us a call and you'll find it handy." Framed and glazed upon the wall behind the dingy little bar was another Pegasus, a theatrical one, with real gauze let in for his wings, golden stars stuck on all over him, and his ethereal harness made of red silk. As it had grown too dusky without to see the sign, and as it had not grown light enough within to see the picture, Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby received no offence from these idealities. They followed the girl up some steep corner stairs without meeting anyone, and stopped in the dark while she went on for a candle. They expected every moment to hear Merrylegs give tongue, but the highly trained performing dog had not barked when the girl and the candle appeared together. "Father is not in our room, sir," she said, with a face of great surprise. "If you wouldn't mind walking in, I'll find him directly." They walked in, and Sissy, having set 2 chairs for them, sped away with a light, quick step. It was a mean, shabbily furnished room with a bed in it. The white nightcap, embellished with 2 peacock's feathers and a pigtail bolt upright, in which Signor Jupe had that very afternoon enlivened the varied performances with his chaste Shakespearean quips and retorts, hung upon a nail. But no other portion of his wardrobe, or other token of himself or his pursuits, was to be seen anywhere. As to Merrylegs, that respectable ancestor of the highly trained animal who went aboard the Ark, might have been accidentally shut out of it, for any sign of a dog that was manifest to eye or ear in the Pegasus Arms. They heard the doors of rooms above opening and shutting as Sissy went from one to another in quest of her father, and presently they heard voices expressing surprise. She came bounding down again in a great hurry, opened a battered and mangy old hair trunk, found it empty, and looked round with her hands clasped and her face full of terror. "Father must have gone down to the booth, sir. I don't know why he should go there, but he must be there. I'll bring him in a minute." She was gone directly, without her bonnet, with her long dark childish hair streaming behind her. "What does she mean?" said Mr. Gradgrind. "Back in a minute? It's more than a mile off." Before Mr. Bounderby could reply, a young man appeared at the door, and introducing himself with the words, "By your leaves, gentlemen," walked in with his hands in his pockets. His face, close shaven, thin, and sallow, was shaded by a great quantity of dark hair, brushed into a roll all round his head and parted up the centre. His legs were very robust, but shorter than legs of good proportion should have been. His chest and back were as much too broad as his legs were too short. He was dressed in a Newmarket coat and tight-fitting trousers, wore a shawl round his neck, smelt of lamp oil, straw, orange peel, horse's provender, and sawdust, and looked a most remarkable sort of centaur, compounded of the stable and the playhouse. Where the one began and the other ended, nobody could have told with any precision. This gentleman was mentioned in the bills of the day as Mr. E.W.B. Childers, so justly celebrated for his daring vaulting act as the wild huntsman of the North American prairies, in which popular performance a diminutive boy with an old face, who now accompanied him, assisted as his infant son, being carried upside down over his father's shoulder by one foot, and held by the crown of his head heels upwards in the palm of his father's hand, according to the violent paternal manner in which wild huntsmen may be observed to fondle their offspring. Made up with curls, wreaths, wings, white bismuth, and carmine, this hopeful young person soared into so pleasing a Cupid as to constitute the chief delight of the maternal part of the spectators; but in private, where his characteristics were a precocious cutaway coat and an extremely gruff voice, he became of the turfy. "By your leaves, gentlemen," said Mr. E.W.B. Childers, glancing round the room. "It was you, I believe, that were wishing to see Jupe." "It was," said Mr. Gradgrind. "His daughter has gone to fetch him, but I can't wait. Therefore, if you please, I will leave a message for him with you." "You see, my friend," Mr. Bounderby put in, "we are the kind of people who know the value of time, and you are the kind of people who don't know the value of time." "I have not," retorted Mr. Childers, after surveying him from head to foot, "the honour of knowing you, but if you mean that you can make more money of your time than I can of mine, I should judge from your appearance that you're about right." "And when you've made it, you can keep it too, I should think," said Cupid. "Kidderminster stow that," said Mr. Childers. Master Kidderminster was Cupid's mortal name. "What has he come here cheeking us for, then?" cried Master Kidderminster, showing a very irascible temperament. "If you want to cheek us, pay your ochre at the doors and take it out." "Kidderminster," said Mr. Childers, raising his voice. "Stow that. Sir," to Mr. Gradgrind, "I was addressing myself to you. You may or you may not be aware, for perhaps you have not been much in the audience, that Jupe has missed his tip very often lately." What has he missed?" asked Mr. Gradgrind, glancing at the potent Bounderby for assistance. "Missed his tip." "Offered at the Garters 4 times last night, and never done 'em once," said Master Kidderminster. "Missed his tip at the Banners, too, and was loose in his ponging." "Didn't do what he ought to do, was short in his leaps and bad in his tumbling," Mr. Childers interpreted. "Oh," said Mr. Gradgrind, "that is tip, is it?" "In a general way, that's missing his tip," Mr. E.W.B. Childers answered. "Nine oils, Merrylegs, missing tips, garters, banners, and ponging, eh?" ejaculated Bounderby, with his laugh of laughs. "Queer sort of company, too, for a man who's raised himself." "Lower yourself, then," retorted Cupid. "Oh Lord, if you've raised yourself so high as all that comes to, let yourself down a bit." "This is a very obtrusive lad," said Mr. Gradgrind, turning and knitting his brows on him. "We'd have had a young gentleman to meet you if we'd known you were coming," retorted Master Kidderminster, nothing abashed. "It's a pity you don't have a bespeak, being so particular. You're on the tight, Jeff, ain't you?" "What does this unmannerly boy mean," asked Mr. Gradgrind, eyeing him in a sort of desperation, "by tight Jeff?" "There, get out," said Mr. Childers, thrusting his young friend from the room, rather in the prairie manner. "Tight Jeff or slack Jeff, it don't much signify. It's only tight rope and slack rope. You were going to give me a message for Jupe?" "Yes, I was." "Then," continued Mr. Childers, quickly, "my opinion is, he will never receive it. Do you know much of him?" "I never saw the man in my life." "I doubt if you ever will see him now. It's pretty plain to me he's off." "Do you mean that he has deserted his daughter?" "Aye, I mean," said Mr. Childers, with a nod, "that he is cut. He was goosed last night. He was goosed the night before last. He was goosed today. He's lately got in the way of always being goosed, and he can't stand it." "Why has he been so very much goosed?" asked Mr. Gradgrind, forcing the word out of himself with great solemnity and reluctance. "His joints are turning stiff, and he's getting used up," said Childers. "He has his points as a cackler still, but he can't get a living out of him." "A cackler," Bounderby repeated. "Here we go again." "A speaker, if the gentleman likes it better," said Mr. E.W.B. Childers, superciliously throwing the interpretation over his shoulder, and accompanying it with a shake of his long hair, which all shook at once. "Now, it's a remarkable fact, sir, that it cut that man deeper to know that his daughter knew of his being goosed than to go through with it." "Good!" interrupted Mr. Bounderby. "This is good, Gradgrind. A man so fond of his daughter that he runs away from her. This is devilish good. Ha, ha! Now, I'll tell you what, young man, I haven't always occupied my present station in life. I know what these things are. You may be astonished to hear it, but my mother ran away from me." E.W.B. Childers replied pointedly that he was not at all astonished to hear it. "Very well," said Bounderby. "I was born in a ditch, and my mother ran away from me. Do I excuse her for it? No. Have I ever excused her for it? Not I. What do I call her for it? I call her probably the very worst woman that ever lived in the world, except my drunken grandmother. There's no family pride about me. There's no imaginative, sentimental humbug about me. I call a spade, and I call the mother of Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, without any fear or any favour, what I should call her if she had been the mother of Dick Jones of Wapping. So with this man. He's a runaway rogue and a vagabond. That's what he is in English. It's all the same to me what he is or what he is not, whether in English or whether in French, retorted Mr. E.W.B. Childers, facing about. I'm telling your friend what's the fact. If you don't like to hear it, you can avail yourself of the open air. You give it mouth enough, you do, but give it mouth in your own building, at least, remonstrated E.W.B. with stern irony. Don't give it mouth in this building till you're called upon. You have got some building of your own, I dare say, now? Perhaps so, replied Mr. Bounderby, rattling his money and laughing. Then give it mouth in your own building, will you, if you please, said Childers, because this isn't a strong building, and too much of you might bring it down. Eyeing Mr. Bounderby from head to foot again, he turned from him, as from a man finally disposed of, to Mr. Gradgrind. Jupe sent his daughter out on an errand not an hour ago, and then was seen to slip out himself, with his hat over his eyes, and a bundle tied up in an handkerchief under his arm. She'll never believe it of him, but he's cut away and left her. Pray, said Mr. Gradgrind, why will she never believe it of him? Because those two were one, because they were never asunder, because up to this time he seemed to dote upon her, said Childers, taking a step or two to look into the empty trunk. Both Mr. Childers and Master Kidderminster walked in a curious manner, with their legs wider apart than the general run of men, and with a very knowing assumption of being stiff in the knees. This walk was common to all the male members of Sleary's company, and was understood to express that they were always on horseback. Poor Sissy! He had better have apprenticed her, said Childers, giving his hair another shake as he looked up from the empty box. Now he leaves her without anything to take to. It is creditable to you, who have never been apprenticed, to express that opinion, returned Mr. Gradgrind approvingly. I never apprenticed. I was apprenticed when I was 7 years old. Oh, indeed, said Mr. Gradgrind rather resentfully, as having been defrauded of his good opinion. I was not aware of its being the custom to apprentice young persons to idleness, Mr. Bounderby put in with a loud laugh. No, by the Lord Harry, nor I. If father always had it in his head, resumed Childers, feigning unconsciousness of Mr. Bounderby's existence, that she was to be taught the deuce and all of education. How it got into his head, I can't say. I can only say it never got out. He's been picking up a bit of reading for her here, a bit of writing for her there, a bit of ciphering for her somewhere else. These 7 years. Mr. E.W.B. Childers took one of his hands out of his pockets, stroked his face and chin, and looked with a good deal of doubt and a little hope at Mr. Gradgrind. From the first he had sought to conciliate that gentleman, for the sake of the deserted girl. When Sissy got into the school here, he pursued, her father was as pleased as Punch. I couldn't altogether make out why, myself, as we were not stationary here, being but comers and goers anywhere. I suppose, however, he had this move in mind, it was always half-cracked, and then considered her provided for. If you should happen to have looked in tonight for the purpose of telling him that you were going to do her any little service, said Mr. Childers, stroking his face again and repeating his look, it will be very fortunate and well timed. Very fortunate and well timed. On the contrary, returned Mr. Gradgrind, I came to tell him that her connections made her not an object for the school, and that she must not attend any more. Still, if her father really has left her without any connivance on her part, Bounderby, let me have a word with you. Upon this, Mr. Childers politely betook himself, with his equestrian walk, to the landing outside the door, and there stood, stroking his face and softly whistling. While thus engaged, he overheard such phrases in Mr. Bounderby's voice as, "No, I say no, I advise you not, I say by no means," while from Mr. Gradgrind he heard in his much lower tone the words, "But even as an example to Louisa of what this pursuit which has been the subject of a vulgar curiosity leads to and ends in, think of it, Bounderby, from that point of view." Meanwhile, the various members of Sleary's company gradually gathered together from the upper regions, where they were quartered, and from standing about talking in low voices to one another and to Mr. Childers, gradually insinuated themselves and him into the room. There were 2 or 3 handsome young women among them, with their 2 or 3 husbands, and their 2 or 3 mothers, and their 8 or 9 little children, who did the fairy business when required. The father of one of the families was in the habit of balancing the father of another of the families on the top of a great pole. The father of a third family often made a pyramid of both those fathers, with Master Kidderminster for the apex, and himself for the base. All the fathers could dance upon rolling casks, stand upon bottles, catch knives and balls, twirl hand basins, ride upon anything, jump over everything, and stick at nothing. All the mothers could and did dance upon the slack wire and the tightrope, and perform rapid acts on barebacked steeds. None of them were at all particular in respect of showing their legs, and one of them, alone in a Greek chariot, drove 6 in hand into every town they came to. They all assumed to be mighty rakish and knowing. They were not very tidy in their private dresses, they were not at all orderly in their domestic arrangements, and the combined literature of the whole company would have produced but a poor letter on any subject. Yet there was a remarkable gentleness and childishness about these people, a special inaptitude for any kind of sharp practice, and an untiring readiness to help and pity one another, deserving often of as much respect, and always of as much generous construction, as the everyday virtues of any class of people in the world. Last of all appeared Mr. Sleary, a stout man, as already mentioned, with one fixed eye and one loose eye, a voice, if it can be called so, like the efforts of a broken old pair of bellows, a flabby surface, and a muddled head which was never sober and never drunk. "Squire!" said Mr. Sleary, who was troubled with asthma, and whose breath came far too thick and heavy for the letter S. "Your servant! This is a bad piece of business, this is. You've heard of my clown and his dog being supposed to have morsed?" He addressed Mr. Gradgrind, who answered, "Yes." "Well, Squire," he returned, taking off his hat and rubbing the lining with his pocket-handkerchief, which he kept inside for the purpose, "is it your intention to do anything for the poor girl, Squire?" "I shall have something to propose to her when she comes back," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Glad to hear it, Squire. Not that I want to get rid of the child, any more than I want to stand in her way. I'm willing to take her 'prentice, though at her age it's late. My voice is a little husky, Squire, and not easy heard by them as don't know me. But if you'd been chilled and heated, heated and chilled, chilled and heated in the ring when you was young, as often as I have been, your voice wouldn't have lasted out, Squire, no more than mine." "I dare say not," said Mr. Gradgrind. "What shall it be, Squire, while you wait? Shall it be Sleary? Give it a name, Squire," said Mr. Sleary, with hospitable ease. "Nothing for me, I thank you," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Don't say nothing, Squire. What does your friend say? If you haven't taken your feed yet, have a glass of bitters." Here his daughter Josephine, a pretty fair-haired girl of 18, who had been tied on a horse at 2 years old, and had made a will at 12, which she always carried about her, expressive of her dying desire to be drawn to the grave by the 2 piebald ponies, cried, "Father, hush! She has come back!" Then came Sissy Jupe, running into the room as she had run out of it, and when she saw them all assembled, and saw their looks, and saw no father there, she broke into a most deplorable cry, and took refuge on the bosom of the most accomplished tightrope lady, herself in the family way, who knelt down on the floor to nurse her and to weep over her. "It's an eternal shame, upon my soul it is," said Sleary. "Oh, my dear father, my good kind father, where are you gone? You are gone to try to do me some good, I know. You are gone away for my sake, I'm sure. And how miserable and helpless you will be without me, poor, poor father, until you come back." It was so pathetic to hear her saying many things of this kind, with her face turned upward and her arms stretched out as if she were trying to stop his departing shadow and embrace it, that no one spoke a word until Mr. Bounderby, growing impatient, took the case in hand. "Now, good people all," said he, "this is wanton waste of time. Let the girl understand the fact. Let her take it from me, if you like, who have been run away from myself. Here, what's your name? Your father has absconded, deserted you, and you mustn't expect to see him again as long as you live." They cared so little for plain fact, these people, and were in that advanced state of degeneracy on the subject, that instead of being impressed by the speaker's strong common sense, they took it in extraordinary dudgeon. The men muttered "shame," and the women "brute," and Sleary in some haste communicated the following hint apart to Mr. Bounderby. "I'll tell you what, Squire. To speak plain to you, my opinion is that you had better cut your thought, and drop it. They're a very good-natured people, my people, but they're accustomed to being quick with their movements, and if you don't act upon my advice, I'm damned if I don't believe they'll piss you out of the winder." Mr. Bounderby being restrained by this mild suggestion, Mr. Gradgrind found an opening for his eminently practical exposition of the subject. "It is of no moment," said he, "whether this person is to be expected back at any time, or the contrary. He has gone away, and there is no present expectation of his return. That, I believe, is agreed on all hands." "That's agreed, Squire. Stick to that," from Sleary. "Well then, I, who came here to inform the father of the poor girl, Jupe, that she could not be received in the school any more, in consequence of there being practical objections into which I need not enter, to the reception there of the children of persons so employed, am prepared in these altered circumstances to make a proposal. I am willing to take charge of you, Jupe, and to educate you and provide for you. The only condition, over and above your good behaviour, I make is, that you decide now, at once, whether to accompany me or remain here. Also, that if you accompany me now, it is understood that you communicate no more with any of your friends who are here present. These observations comprise the whole of the case. At the same time, said Sleary, I must put in my word, Squire, so that both sides of the banner may be equally seen. If you like, Cecilia, to be prenticed, you know the nature of the work and you know your companions. Emma Gordon, in whose lap you're a lying at present, would be a mother to you, and Josephine would be a sister to you. I don't pretend to be of the angel breed myself, and I don't say but what when you missed your tip you'd find me cut up rough and swear an oath or two at you. But what I say, Squire, is that, good-tempered or bad-tempered, I never did a horse an injury yet, no more than swearing at him went, and that I don't expect I shall begin otherwise at my time of life, with a rider. I never was much of a cackler, Squire, but I have said my say. The latter part of the speech was addressed to Mr. Gradgrind, who received it with a grave inclination of his head, and then remarked, The only observation I will make to you, Jupe, in the way of influencing your decision, is, that it is highly desirable to have a sound practical education, and that even your father himself, from what I understand, appears on your behalf to have known and felt that much. The last words had a visible effect upon her. She stopped in her wild crying, a little detached herself from Emma Gordon, and turned her face full upon her patron. The whole company perceived the force of the change, and drew a long breath together, that plainly said, She will go. Be sure you know your own mind, Jupe, Mr. Gradgrind cautioned her. I say no more. Be sure you know your own mind. When father comes back, cried the girl, bursting into tears again after a minute's silence, how will he ever find me if I go away? You may be quite at ease, said Mr. Gradgrind calmly. He worked out the whole matter like a sum. You may be quite at ease, Jupe, on that score. In such a case your father, I apprehend, must find out Mr. Sleary. That's my name, Squire, not ashamed of it. Known all over England, and always pays its way. Must find out Mr. Sleary, who would then let him know where you went. I should have no power of keeping you against his wish, and he would have no difficulty at any time in finding Mr. Thomas Gradgrind of Coketown. I am well known. Well known, assented Mr. Sleary, rolling his loose eye. You're one of the sort, Squire, that keeps a precious sight of money out of the house. But never mind that at present. There was another silence, and then she exclaimed, sobbing with her hands before her face, Oh, give me my clothes, and let me go away before I break my heart. The women sadly bestirred themselves to get the clothes together. It was soon done, for they were not many, and to pack them in a basket which had often travelled with them. Sissy sat all the time upon the ground, still sobbing and covering her eyes. Mr. Gradgrind and his friend Bounderby stood near the door, ready to take her away. Mr. Sleary stood in the middle of the room, with the male members of the company around him, exactly as he would have stood in the centre of the ring during his daughter Josephine's performance. He wanted nothing but his whip. The basket packed in silence, they brought her bonnet to her, and smoothed her disordered hair, and put it on. Then they pressed about her, and bent over her in very natural attitudes, kissing and embracing her, and brought the children to take leave of her, and were a tender-hearted, simple, foolish set of women altogether. Now, Jupe, said Mr. Gradgrind, if you are quite determined, come. But she had to take her farewell of the male part of the company yet, and every one of them had to unfold his arms, for they all assumed the professional attitude when they found themselves near Sleary, and give her a parting kiss, Master Kidderminster excepted, in whose young nature there was an original flavour of the misanthrope, who was also known to have harboured matrimonial views, and who moodily withdrew. Mr. Sleary was reserved until the last. Opening his arms wide, he took her by both hands, and would have sprung up and down after the riding-master manner of congratulating young ladies on their dismounting from a rapid act, but there was no rebound in Sissy, and she only stood before him, crying. Good-bye, my dear, said Sleary. You'll make your fortune, I hope, and none of our poor folks'll ever trouble you, I'll pound it. I wish your father hadn't taken his dog with him. It's an ill convenience to have the dog out of the bilth, but on second thoughts, he wouldn't have performed without his master, though it's as broad as is long. With that he regarded her attentively with his fixed eye, surveyed his company with his loose one, kissed her, shook his head, and handed her to Mr. Gradgrind as to a horse. There she is, Squire, he said, sweeping her with a professional glance as if she were being adjusted in her seat, and she'll do you justice. Good-bye, Cecilia. Good-bye, Cecilia. Good-bye, Sissy. God bless you, dear, in a variety of voices from all over the room. But the writing-master had observed the bottle of the 9 oils in her bosom, and he now interposed with, "Leave the bottle, my dear. It's large to carry. It will be of no use to you now. Give it to me." "No, no," she said in another burst of tears. "Oh, no. Pray let me keep it for father till he comes back. He'll want it when he comes back. He had never thought of going away when he sent me for it. I must keep it for him, if you please." "So be it, my dear. You see how it is, Squire. Farewell, Cecilia. My last word to you is this. Stick to the terms of your engagement, be obedient to the Squire, and forget us. But if, when you're grown up and married and well off, you come upon any horse riding ever, don't be hard upon it, don't be cross with it, give it a bespeak if you can, and think how you might do worse. People must be amused, Squire, somehow," continued Sleary, rendered more pursy than ever by so much talking. "They can't be always a-working, nor yet they can't be always a-learning. Make the best of us, not the worst. I've got my living out of the horse riding all my life, I know, but I consider that I lay down the philosophy of the subject when I say to you, Squire, make the best of us, not the worst." The Sleary philosophy was propounded as they went downstairs, and the fixed eye of philosophy, and its rolling eye too, soon lost the 3 figures and the basket in the darkness of the street. End of Section 3. Recording by Rosalind Wills of Silver Spring, Maryland.
Section 4 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joseph Ugaretz. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 4, Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7. Mrs Sparset. Mr. Bounderby being a bachelor, an elderly lady presided over his establishment, in consideration of a certain annual stipend. Mrs. Sparset was this lady's name, and she was a prominent figure in attendance on Mr. Bounderby's car as it rolled along in triumph with the bully of humility inside. For Mrs. Sparset had not only seen different days, but was highly connected. She had a great aunt living in these very times, called Lady Scadgers. Mr. Sparset, deceased, of whom she was the relict, had been by the mother's side what Mrs. Sparset still called a powler. Strangers of limited information and dull apprehension were sometimes observed not to know what a powler was, and even to appear uncertain whether it might be a business, or a political party, or a profession of faith. The better class of minds, however, did not need to be informed that the powlers were an ancient stock, who could trace themselves so exceedingly far back that it was not surprising if they sometimes lost themselves, which they had rather frequently done as respected horseflesh, blind hookey, Hebrew monetary transactions, and the insolvent debtor's court. The late Mr. Sparset, being by the mother's side a powler, married this lady, being by the father's side a Scadgers. Lady Scadgers, an immensely fat old woman with an inordinate appetite for butcher's meat and a mysterious leg which had now refused to get out of bed for 14 years, contrived the marriage, at a period when Sparset was just of age and chiefly noticeable for a slender body, weakly supported on 2 long slim props, and surmounted by no head worth mentioning. He inherited a fair fortune from his uncle, but owed it all before he came into it, and spent it twice over immediately afterwards. Thus, when he died at 24, the scene of his decease, Calais, and the cause, brandy, he did not leave his widow, from whom he had been separated soon after the honeymoon, in affluent circumstances. That bereaved lady, 15 years older than he, fell presently at deadly feud with her only relative, Lady Scadgers, and, partly to spite her ladyship, and partly to maintain herself, went out at a salary. And here she was now, in her elderly days, with the Coriolanian style of nose and the dense black eyebrows which had captivated Sparset, making Mr. Bounderby's tea as he took his breakfast. If Bounderby had been a conqueror, and Mrs. Sparset a captive princess whom he took about as a feature in his state processions, he could not have made a greater flourish with her than he habitually did. Just as it belonged to his boastfulness to depreciate his own extraction, so it belonged to it to exalt Mrs. Sparset's. In the measure that he would not allow his own youth to have been attended by a single favorable circumstance, he brightened Mrs. Sparset's juvenile career with every possible advantage, and showered wagon-loads of early roses all over that lady's path. "And yet, sir," he would say, "how does it turn out, after all? Why, here she is at 100 a year. I give her 100, which she is pleased to term handsome, keeping the house of Josiah Bounderby of Coketown." Nay, he made this foil of his so very widely known that third parties took it up, and handled it on some occasions with considerable briskness. It was one of the most exasperating attributes of Bounderby that he not only sang his own praises, but stimulated other men to sing them. There was a moral infection of claptrap in him. Strangers, modest enough elsewhere, started up at dinners in Coketown and boasted, in quite a rampant way, of Bounderby. They made him out to be the Royal Arms, the Union Jack, Magna Carta, John Bull, Habeas Corpus, the Bill of Rights, an Englishman's house as his castle, church and state, and God save the Queen, all put together. And as often, and it was very often, as an orator of this kind brought into his peroration, "Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath has made," it was for certain more or less understood among the company that he had heard of Mrs. Sparset. "Mr. Bounderby," said Mrs. Sparset, "you are unusually slow, sir, with your breakfast this morning." "Why, ma'am," he returned, "I am thinking about Tom Gradgrind's whim." Tom Gradgrind, for a bluff, independent manner of speaking, as if somebody were always endeavouring to bribe him with immense sums to say Thomas, and he wouldn't. "Tom Gradgrind's whim, ma'am, of bringing up the tumbling girl." "The girl is now waiting to know," said Mrs. Sparset, "whether she is to go straight to the school or up to the lodge." "She must wait, ma'am," answered Bounderby, "till I know myself. We shall have Tom Gradgrind down here presently, I suppose. If he should wish her to remain here a day or two longer, of course she can, ma'am." "Of course she can, if you wish it, Mr. Bounderby." "I told him I should give her a shake down here last night, in order that he might sleep on it before he decided to let her have any association with Louisa." "Indeed, Mr. Bounderby, very thoughtful of you." Mrs. Sparset's Coriolanian nose underwent a slight expansion of the nostrils, and her black eyebrows contracted as she took a sip of tea. "It's tolerably clear to me," said Bounderby, "that the little puss can get small good out of such companionship." "Are you speaking of young Miss Gradgrind, Mr. Bounderby?" "Yes, ma'am, I'm speaking of Louisa." "Your observation being limited to little puss," said Mrs. Sparset, "and there being two little girls in question, I did not know which might be indicated by that expression." "Louisa," repeated Mr. Bounderby. "Louisa, Louisa." "You are quite another father to Louisa, sir." Mrs. Sparset took a little more tea, and as she bent her again contracted eyebrows over her steaming cup, rather looked as if her classical countenance were invoking the infernal gods. "If you had said I was another father to Tom, young Tom, I mean, not my friend Tom Gradgrind, you might have been nearer the mark. I am going to take young Tom into my office, going to have him under my wing, ma'am." "Indeed? Rather young for that, is he not, sir?" Mrs. Sparset's "sir," in addressing Mr. Bounderby, was a word of ceremony, rather extracting consideration for herself in the use than honouring him. "I'm not going to take him at once. He is to finish his educational cramming before then," said Bounderby. "By the Lord Harry, he'll have enough of it first and last. He'd open his eyes, that boy would, if he knew how empty of learning my young Ma was at his time of life. Which, by the by, he probably did know, for he had heard of it often enough. But it's extraordinary the difficulty I have on scores of such subjects in speaking to anyone on equal terms. Here, for example, I've been speaking to you this morning about tumblers. Why, what do you know about tumblers? At the time when, to have been a tumbler in the mud of the streets would have been a godsend to me, a prize in the lottery to me, you were at the Italian Opera. You were coming out of the Italian Opera, ma'am, in white satin and jewels, a blaze of splendor, when I hadn't a penny to buy a link to light you." "I certainly, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset, with a dignity serenely mournful, "was familiar with the Italian Opera at a very early age." "Egad, ma'am, so was I," said Bounderby, "with the wrong side of it. A hard bed the pavement of its arcade used to make, I assure you. People like you, ma'am, accustomed from infancy to lie on down feathers, have no idea how hard a paving stone is without trying it. No, it's of no use my talking to you about tumblers. I should speak of foreign dancers, and the West End of London, and Mayfair, and lords and ladies and honourables." "I trust, sir," rejoined Mrs. Sparset, with decent resignation, "it is not necessary that you should do anything of that kind. I hope I have learned how to accommodate myself to the changes of life. If I have acquired an interest in hearing of your instructive experiences, and can scarcely hear enough of them, I claim no merit for that, since I believe it is a general sentiment." "Well, ma'am," said her patron, "perhaps some people may be pleased to say that they do like to hear, in his own unpolished way, what Josiah Bounderby of Coketown has gone through, but you must confess that you were born in the lap of luxury yourself. Come, ma'am, you know you were born in the lap of luxury." "I do not, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset, with a shake of her head, "deny it." Mr. Bounderby was obliged to get up from table and stand with his back to the fire, looking at her. She was such an enhancement of his position. "And you were in crack society, devilish high society," he said, warming his legs. "It is true, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset, with an affectation of humility the very opposite of his, and therefore in no danger of jostling it. "You were in the tip-top fashion, and all the rest of it," said Mr. Bounderby. "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset, with a kind of social widowhood upon her. "It is unquestionably true." Mr. Bounderby, bending himself at the knees, literally embraced his legs in his great satisfaction, and laughed aloud. Mr. and Miss Gradgrind being then announced, he received the former with a shake of the hand, and the latter with a kiss. "Can Jupe be sent here, Bounderby?" asked Mr. Gradgrind. Certainly. So Jupe was sent there. On coming in, she curtsied to Mr. Bounderby and to his friend Tom Gradgrind, and also to Louisa, but in her confusion unluckily omitted Mrs. Sparset. Observing this, the blusterous Bounderby had the following remarks to make. "Now, I tell you what, my girl, the name of that lady by the teapot is Mrs. Sparset. That lady acts as mistress of this house, and she is a highly connected lady. Consequently, if ever you come again into any room in this house, you will make a short stay in it, if you don't behave towards that lady in your most respectful manner. Now, I don't care a button what you do to me, because I don't affect to be anybody. So, far from having high connections, I have no connections at all, and I come of the scum of the earth. But towards that lady, I do care what you do, and you shall do what is deferential and respectful, or you shall not come here." "I hope, Bounderby," said Mr. Gradgrind in a conciliatory voice, "that this was merely an oversight." "My friend Tom Gradgrind suggests, Mrs. Sparset," said Bounderby, "that this was merely an oversight." "Very likely. However, as you are aware, ma'am, I don't allow of even oversights towards you." "You are very good indeed, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset, shaking her head with her state humility. "It is not worth speaking of." Sissy, who all this time had been faintly excusing herself with tears in her eyes, was now waved over by the master of the house to Mr. Gradgrind. She stood looking intently at him, and Louisa stood coldly by, with her eyes upon the ground, while he proceeded thus. "Jupe, I have made up my mind to take you into my house, and when you are not in attendance at the school, to employ you about Mrs. Gradgrind, who is rather an invalid. I have explained to Miss Louisa, this is Miss Louisa, the miserable but natural end of your late career, and you are to expressly understand that the whole of that subject matter is past. It's not to be referred to any more. From this time you begin your history. You are, at present, ignorant, I know." "Yes, sir, very," she answered, curtsying. "I shall have the satisfaction of causing you to be strictly educated, and you will be a living proof to all who come into communication with you of the advantages of the training you will receive. You will be reclaimed and formed. You have been in the habit now of reading to your father, and those people I found you among, I dare say?" said Mr. Gradgrind, beckoning her nearer to him before he said so, and dropping his voice. "Only to father and Merrylegs, sir. At least I mean to father, when Merrylegs was always there." "Never mind Merrylegs, Jupe," said Mr. Gradgrind with a passing frown. "I don't ask about him. I understand you to have been in the habit of reading to your father." "Oh, yes, sir, thousands of times. They were the happiest. Oh, of all the happy times we had together, sir." It was only now, when her sorrow broke out, that Louisa looked at her. "And what," asked Mr. Gradgrind in a still lower voice, "did you read to your father, Jupe?" "About the fairies, sir, and the dwarf, and the hunchback, and the genies," she sobbed out, "and about—" "Hush!" said Mr. Gradgrind. "That is enough. Never breathe a word of such destructive nonsense any more. Bounderby, this is a case for rigid training, and I shall observe it with interest." "Well," returned Mr. Bounderby, "I have given you my opinion already, and I shouldn't do as you do. But very well, since you are bent upon it, very well." So Mr. Gradgrind and his daughter took Cecilia Jupe off with them to Stone Lodge, and on the way Louisa never spoke one word, good or bad, and Mr. Bounderby went about his daily pursuits, and Mrs. Sparset got behind her eyebrows and meditated in the gloom of that retreat all the evening. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Never Wonder. Let us strike the keynote again before pursuing the tune. When she was half a dozen years younger, Louisa had been overheard to begin a conversation with her brother one day by saying, "Tom, I wonder," upon which Mr. Gradgrind, who was the person overhearing, stepped forth into the light and said, "Louisa, never wonder." Herein lay the spring of the mechanical art and mystery of educating the reason without stooping to the cultivation of the sentiments and affections. Never wonder. By means of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, settle everything somehow, and never wonder. Bring to me, Machokum child, yonder baby just able to walk, and I will engage that it shall never wonder. Now, besides very many babies just able to walk, there happened to be in Coketown a considerable population of babies who had been walking against time towards the infinite world 20, 30, 40, 50 years and more. These portentous infants being alarming creatures to talk about in any human society, the 18 denominations incessantly scratched one another's faces and pulled one another's hair by way of agreeing on the steps to be taken for their improvement, which they never did. A surprising circumstance when the happy adaptation of the means to the end is considered. Still, although they differed in every other particular, conceivable and inconceivable, especially inconceivable, they were pretty well united on the point that these unlucky infants were never to wonder. Body number 1 said they must take everything on trust. Body number 2 said they must take everything on political economy. Body number 3 wrote leaden little books for them, showing how the good grown-up baby invariably got to the savings bank, and the bad grown-up baby invariably got transported. Body number 4, under dreary pretenses of being droll, when it was very melancholy indeed, made the shallowest pretenses of concealing pitfalls of knowledge, into which it was the duty of these babies to be smuggled and inveigled. But all the bodies agreed that they were never to wonder. There was a library in Coketown to which general access was easy. Mr. Gradgrind greatly tormented his mind about what the people read in this library, a point whereon little rivers of tabular statements periodically flowed into the howling ocean of tabular statements, which no diver ever got to any depth in and came up sane. It was a disheartening circumstance, but a melancholy fact, that even these readers persisted in wondering. They wondered about human nature, human passions, human hopes and fears, the struggles, triumphs and defeats, the cares and joys and sorrows, the lives and deaths of common men and women. They sometimes, after 15 hours' work, sat down to read mere fables about men and women, more or less like themselves, and about children, more or less like their own. They took Defoe to their bosoms instead of Euclid, and seemed to be on the whole more comforted by Goldsmith than by Cocker. Mr. Gradgrind was forever working, in print and out of print, at this eccentric sum, and he never could make out how it yielded this unaccountable product. "I am sick of my life, Lou. I hate it altogether, and I hate everybody except you," said the unnatural young Thomas Gradgrind in the hair-cutting chamber at twilight. "You don't hate Sissy, Tom." "I hate to be obliged to call her Jupe, and she hates me," said Tom moodily. "No, she does not, Tom, I'm sure." "She must," said Tom. "She must just hate and detest the whole set out of us. They'll bother her head off, I think, before they have done with her. Already she's getting as pale as wax and as heavy as I am." Young Thomas expressed these sentiments sitting astride of a chair before the fire, with his arms on the back and his sulky face on his arms. His sister sat in the darker corner by the fireside, now looking at him, now looking at the bright sparks as they dropped upon the hearth. "As to me," said Tom, tumbling his hair all manner of ways with his sulky hands, I am a donkey, that's what I am. I am as obstinate as one, I am more stupid than one, I get as much pleasure as one, and I should like to kick like one. Not me, I hope, Tom. No, Lou, I wouldn't hurt you. I made an exception of you at first. I don't know what this jolly old jaundiced jail— Tom had paused to find a sufficiently complimentary and expressive name for the parental roof, and seemed to relieve his mind for a moment by the strong alliteration of this one— would be without you. Indeed, Tom, do you really and truly say so? Why, of course I do. What's the use of talking about it? Returned Tom, chafing his face on his coat sleeve as if to mortify his flesh and have it in unison with his spirit. Because, Tom, said his sister, after silently watching the sparks a while, as I get older and nearer growing up, I often sit wondering here and think how unfortunate it is for me that I can't reconcile you to home better than I am able to do. I don't know what other girls know. I can't play to you or sing to you. I can't talk to you so as to lighten your mind, for I never see any amusing sights or read any amusing books that it would be a pleasure or a relief to you to talk about when you are tired. Well, no more do I. I'm as bad as you in that respect, and I'm a mule, too, which you're not. If father was determined to make me either a prig or a mule, and I'm not a prig, why, it stands to reason I must be a mule. And so I am, said Tom desperately. It's a great pity, said Louisa after another pause, and speaking thoughtfully out of her dark corner. It's a great pity, Tom. It's very unfortunate for both of us. Oh, you, said Tom, you're a girl, Lou, and a girl comes out of it better than a boy does. I don't miss anything in you. You're the only pleasure I have. You can brighten even this place, and you can always lead me as you like. You are a dear brother, Tom, and while you think I can do such things, I don't so much mind knowing better, though I do know better, Tom, and am very sorry for it. She came and kissed him, and went back into her corner again. I wish I could collect all the facts we hear so much about, said Tom, spitefully setting his teeth, and all the figures, and all the people who found them out, and I wish I could put 1,000 barrels of gunpowder under them, and blow them all up together. However, when I go to live with old Bounderby, I'll have my revenge. Your revenge, Tom? I mean, I'll enjoy myself a little, and go about and see something, and hear something. I'll recompense myself for the way in which I've been brought up. But don't disappoint yourself beforehand, Tom. Mr. Bounderby thinks as father thinks, and is a great deal rougher, and not half so kind. Oh, said Tom, laughing, I don't mind that. I shall very well know how to manage and smooth old Bounderby. Their shadows were defined upon the wall, but those of the high presses in the room were all blended together on the wall and on the ceiling, as if the brother and sister were overhung by a dark cavern, or a fanciful imagination, if such treason could have been there, might have made it out to be the shadow of their subject, and of its lowering association with their future. What is your great mode of smoothing and managing, Tom? Is it a secret? Oh, said Tom, if it is a secret, it's not far off. It's you. You are his little pet. You are his favorite. He'll do anything for you. When he says to me what I don't like, I shall say to him, My sister Lou will be hurt and disappointed, Mr. Bounderby. She always used to tell me that she was sure you would be easier with me than this. That'll bring him about, or nothing will. After waiting for some answering remark and getting none, Tom wearily relapsed into the present time, and twined himself yawning round and about the rails of his chair, and rumpled his head more and more, until he suddenly looked up and asked, Have you gone to sleep, Lou? No, Tom. I am looking at the fire. You seem to find more to look at in it than I ever could find, said Tom. Another of the advantages, I suppose, of being a girl. Tom, inquired his sister slowly, and in a curious tone, as if she were reading what she asked in the fire, and it was not quite plainly written there, do you look forward with any satisfaction to this change to Mr. Bounderby's? Why, there's one thing to be said of it, returned Tom, pushing his chair from him and standing up. It will be getting away from home. There is one thing to be said of it, Louisa repeated in her former curious tone. It will be getting away from home. Yes. Not but what I shall be very unwilling both to leave you, Lou, and to leave you here. But I must go, you know, whether I like it or not, and I had better go where I can take with me some advantage of your influence than where I should lose it altogether. Don't you see? Yes, Tom. The answer was so long in coming, though there was no indecision in it, that Tom went and leaned on the back of her chair to contemplate the fire which so engrossed her from her point of view, and see what he could make of it. "Except that it is a fire," said Tom, "it looks to me as stupid and blank as everything else looks. What do you see in it? Not a circus." "I don't see anything in it, Tom, particularly, but since I have been looking at it, I have been wondering about you and me grown up." "Wondering again," said Tom. "I have such unmanageable thoughts," returned his sister, "that they will wonder." "Then I beg of you, Louisa," said Mrs. Gradgrind, who had opened the door without being heard, "to do nothing of that description. For goodness' sake, you inconsiderate girl, or I shall never hear the last of it from your father. And Thomas, it is really shameful, with my poor head continually wearing me out, that a boy brought up as you have been, and whose education has cost what yours has, should be found encouraging his sister to wonder, when he knows his father has expressly said that she is not to do it." Louisa denied Tom's participation in the offence, but her mother stopped her with the conclusive answer, "Louisa, don't tell me in my state of health, for unless you had been encouraged, it is morally and physically impossible that you could have done it." "I was encouraged by nothing, mother, but by looking at the red sparks dropping out of the fire and whitening and dying. It made me think, after all, how short my life would be, and how little I could hope to do in it." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Gradgrind, rendered almost energetic. "Nonsense! Don't stand there and tell me such stuff, Louisa, to my face, when you know very well that if it was ever to reach your father's ears I should never hear the last of it. After all the trouble that has been taken with you, after the lectures you have attended, and the experiments you have seen, after I have heard you myself, when the whole of my right side has been benumbed, going on with your master about combustion and calcination and calorification, and I may say every kind of ation that could drive a poor invalid distracted, to hear you talking in this absurd way about sparks and ashes. I wish," whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, taking a chair and discharging her strongest point before succumbing under these mere shadows of facts, "yes, I really do wish that I had never had a family, and then you would have known what it was to do without me." End of Chapter 8. End of Section 4. Recording by Joseph Ugaritz, www.mountebank.org.
Section 5 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens, Chapter 9 and 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 9. Sissy's Progress. Sissy Jupe had not an easy time of it between Mr. M. Choakumchild and Mrs. Gradgrind, and was not without strong impulses in the first months of her probation to run away. It hailed facts all day long so very hard, and life in general was open to her as such a closely ruled ciphering book, that assuredly she would have run away, but for only one restraint. It is lamentable to think of, but this restraint was the result of no arithmetical process, was self-imposed in defiance of all calculation, and went dead against any table of probabilities that any actuary would have drawn up from the premises. The girl believed that her father had not deserted her. She lived in the hope that he would come back, and in the faith that he would be made the happier by her remaining where she was. The wretched ignorance with which Jupe clung to this consolation, rejecting the superior comfort of knowing, on a sound arithmetical basis, that her father was an unnatural vagabond, filled Mr. Gradgrind with pity. Yet what was to be done? M. Choakumchild reported that she had a very dense head for figures, that Once possessed with a general idea of the globe, she took the smallest conceivable interest in its exact measurements, that she was extremely slow in the acquisition of dates, unless some pitiful incident happened to be concerned therewith, that she would burst into tears on being required, by the mental process, immediately to name the cost of 247 muslin caps at 14 pence halfpenny, that she was as low down in the school as low could be, that, after 8 weeks of induction into the elements of political economy, she had only yesterday been set right by a prattler 3 feet high for returning to the question, "What is the first principle of this science?" The absurd answer, "To do unto others as I would that they should do unto me." Mr. Gradgrind observed, shaking his head, that all this was very bad, that it showed the necessity of infinite grinding at the mill of knowledge, as per system, schedule, blue book, report, and tabular statements, A to Z, and that Jupe must be kept to it. So Jupe was kept to it, and became low-spirited, but no wiser. "It would be a fine thing to be you, Miss Louisa," she said one night, when Louisa had endeavoured to make her perplexities for next day something clearer to her. "Do you think so?" "I should know so much, Miss Louisa. All that is difficult to me now would be so easy then." "You might not be better for it, Sissy." Sissy submitted after a little hesitation. "I should not be the worse, Miss Louisa." To which Louisa answered, "Oh, I don't know that." There had been so little communication between these two, both because life at Stone Lodge went monotonously round like a piece of machinery which discouraged human interference, and because of the prohibition relative to Sissy's past career, that they were still almost strangers. Sissy, with her dark eyes wonderingly directed to Louisa's face, was uncertain whether to say more or to remain silent. "You are more useful to my mother and more pleasant with me than I can ever be," Louisa resumed. "You are pleasanter to yourself than I am to myself." "But if you please, Miss Louisa," Sissy pleaded, "I am, oh, so stupid." Louisa, with a brighter laugh than usual, told her she would be wiser by and by. "Oh, you don't know," said Sissy, half crying, "what a stupid girl I am. All through school hours I make mistakes. Mr. and Mrs. Coketown call me up over and over again regularly to make mistakes. I can't help them. They seem to come natural to me." "Mr. and Mrs. Coketown never make any mistakes themselves, I suppose, Sissy?" "Oh, no," she eagerly returned. "They know everything." "Well, tell me some of your mistakes." "I am almost ashamed," said Sissy with reluctance. "But today, for instance, Mr. Coketown was explaining to us about natural prosperity." "National, I think it must have been," observed Louisa. Yes, it was. But isn't it the same?" she timidly asked. "You had better say national, as he said so," returned Louisa, with her dry reserve. "National prosperity. And he said now this schoolroom is a nation, and in this nation there are 50 millions of money. Isn't this a prosperous nation? Girl number 20, isn't this a prosperous nation? And ain't you in a thriving state?" "What did you say?" asked Louisa. "Miss Louisa, I said I didn't know. I thought I couldn't know whether it was a prosperous nation or not, and whether I was in a thriving state or not, unless I knew who had got the money, and whether any of it was mine, but that had nothing to do with it. It was not in the figures at all," said Sissy, wiping her eyes. "Oh, that was a great mistake of yours," observed Louisa. Yes, Miss Louisa, I know it was now. Then Mr. Choakumchild said he would try me again, and he said, this schoolroom is an immense town, and in it there are 1,000,000 of inhabitants, and only 25 are starved to death in the streets in the course of a year. What is your remark on that proportion? And my remark was, for I couldn't think of a better one, that I thought it must be just as hard upon those who were starved, whether the others were 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000, and that was wrong too. Of course it is. Then Mr. Choakumchild said he would try me once more, and he said, oh, here are the stutterings. Statistics, said Louisa. Yes, Miss Louisa. They always remind me of stutterings, and that's another of my mistakes, of accidents upon the sea. And I find, Mr. Choakumchild said, that in a given time 100,000 persons went to sea on long voyages, and only 500 of them were drowned or burnt to death. What is the percentage? And I said, Miss... Here Sissy fairly sobbed, as confessing with extreme contrition to her greatest error. I said it was nothing. Nothing, Sissy? Nothing, miss, to the relations and friends of the people who were killed. I shall never learn, said Sissy. And the worst of it is that although my poor father wished me to so much to learn, and although I'm anxious to learn because he wished me to, I'm afraid I don't like it. Louisa stood looking at the pretty modest head, as it drooped abashed before her until it was raised again to glance at her face. Then she asked, did your father know so much himself that he wished you to be well taught too, Sissy? Sissy hesitated before replying, and so plainly showed her sense that they were entering on forbidden ground that Louisa added, no one hears us, and if anyone did, I'm sure no harm could be found in such an innocent question. No, Miss Louisa, answered Sissy, upon this encouragement, shaking her head. Father knows very little indeed. It's as much as he can do to write, and it's more than people in general can do to read his writing, though it is plain to me. And your mother? Father says she was quite a scholar. She died when I was born. She was... Sissy made the terrible communication nervously. She was a dancer. Did your father love her? Louisa asked these questions with a strong, wild, wandering interest peculiar to her, an interest gone astray like a banished creature and hiding in solitary places. Oh, yes, as dearly as he loves me. Father loved me first for her sake. He carried me about with him when I was quite a baby. We have never been asunder from that time. Yet he leaves you now, Sissy? Only for my good. Nobody understands him as I do. Nobody knows him as I do. When he left me for my good, he never would have left me for his own. I know he was almost broken-hearted with the trial. He will not be happy for a single minute till he comes back. Tell me more about him, said Louisa. I will never ask you again. Where did you live? Oh, we travelled about the country and had no fixed place to live in. Father's a... Sissy whispered the awful word. A clown. To make the people laugh, said Louisa with a nod of intelligence. Yes, but they wouldn't laugh sometimes, and then Father cried. Lately they very often wouldn't laugh, and he used to come home despairing. Father's not like most. Those who didn't know him as well as I do, and didn't love him as dearly as I do, might believe he was not quite right. Sometimes they played tricks upon him. They never knew how he felt them, and shrunk up when he was alone with me. He was far, far timider than they thought. And you were his comfort through everything? She nodded, with the tears rolling down her face. I hope so. And Father said I was. It was because he grew so scared and trembling, and because he felt himself to be a poor, weak, ignorant, helpless man. Those used to be his words, that he wanted me so much to know a great deal and be different from him. I used to read to him to cheer his courage, and he was very fond of that. They were wrong books. I'm never to speak of them here, but we didn't know there was any harm in them." "And he liked them?" said Louisa, with her searching gaze on Sissy all the time. "Oh, very much. They kept him many times from what did him real harm. And often of a night he used to forget all his troubles, and wondering whether the Sultan would let the lady go on with the story, or would have her head cut off before it was finished." "And your father was always kind to the last?" asked Louisa, contravening the great principle, and wondering very much. "Always, always," returned Sissy, clasping her hands. "Kinder than I can tell. He was angry only one night, and that was not to me, but Merrylegs, she whispered the awful fact, is his performing dog." "Why was he angry with the dog?" Louisa demanded. "Father, soon after they came home from performing, told Merrylegs to jump up on the backs of the two chairs and stand across them, which is one of his tricks. He looked at father and didn't do it at once. Everything of father's had gone wrong that night, and he hadn't pleased the public at all. He cried out that the very dog knew he was failing, and had no compassion on him. Then he beat the dog, and I was frightened and said, 'Father, father, pray don't hurt the creature who is so fond of you. Oh, heaven forgive you, father, stop.' And he stopped, and the dog was bloody, and father lay down crying on the floor with the dog in his arms, and the dog licked his face." Louisa saw that she was sobbing, and going to her, kissed her, took her hand, and sat down beside her. "Finish by telling me how your father left you, Sissy. Now that I have asked you so much, tell me the end. The blame, if there is any blame, is mine, not yours." "My dear Miss Louisa," said Sissy, covering her eyes and sobbing yet, "I came home from school that afternoon and found poor father just come home too from the booth, and he sat rocking himself over the fire, as if he was in pain, and I said, 'Have you hurt yourself, father?' as he did sometimes, like they all did, and he said, 'A little, my darling.' And when I came to stoop down and look up at his face, I saw he was crying. The more I spoke to him, the more he hid his face, and at first he shook all over and said nothing but 'my darling' and 'my love.'" Here Tom came lounging in, and stared at the two with a coolness not particularly savouring of interest in anything but himself, and not much of that at present. "I'm asking Sissy a few questions, Tom," observed his sister. "You have no occasion to go away, but don't interrupt us for a moment, Tom, dear." "Oh, very well," returned Tom, "only father has brought old Bounderby home, and I want you to come into the drawing-room, because if you come, there's a good chance of old Bounderby's asking me to dinner, and if you don't, there's none." "I'll come directly." "I'll wait for you," said Tom, "to make sure." Sissy resumed in a lower voice. "At last poor father said that he had given no satisfaction again, and never did give any satisfaction now, and that he was a shame and a disgrace, and I should have done better without him all along. I said all the affectionate things to him that came into my heart, and presently he was quiet, and I sat down by him and told him all about the school and everything that had been said and done there. When I had no more left to tell, he put his arms round my neck and kissed me a great many times. Then he asked me to fetch some of the stuff he had used for the little hurt he had had, and to get it at the best place, which was at the other end of the town from there, and then, after kissing me again, he let me go. When I had gone downstairs, I turned back that I might be a little bit more company to him yet, and looked in at the door and said, "Father dear, shall I take Merrylegs?" Father shook his head and said, "No, Sissy, no. Take nothing that's known to be mine, my darling." And I left him sitting by the fire. Then the thought must have come upon him, poor, poor father, of going away to try something for my sake, for when I came back, he was gone. "I say, look sharp for old Bounderby, Lou," Tom remonstrated. "There's nothing more to tell, Miss Louisa. I kept the 9 oils ready for him, and I know he will come back. Every letter that I see in Mr. Gradgrind's hands takes my breath away and blinds my eyes, for I think it comes from father, or from Mr. Sleary about father. Mr. Sleary promised to write as soon as ever father should be heard of, and I trust him to keep his word." "Do look sharp for old Bounderby, Lou," said Tom with an impatient whistle. "He'll be off if you don't look sharp." After this, whenever Sissy dropped a curtsy to Mr. Gradgrind in the presence of his family, and said in a faltering way, "I beg your pardon, sir, for being troublesome, but have you had any letter yet about me?" Louisa would suspend the occupation of the moment, whatever it was, and look for a reply as earnestly as Sissy did. And when Mr. Gradgrind regularly answered, "No, Jupe, nothing of the sort," the trembling of Sissy's lip would be repeated in Louisa's face, and her eyes would follow Sissy with compassion to the door. Mr. Gradgrind usually improved these occasions by remarking, when she was gone, that if Jupe had been properly trained from an early age, she would have demonstrated to herself on sound principles the baselessness of these fantastic hopes. Yet it did seem, though not to him, for he saw nothing of it, as if fantastic hope could take as strong a hold as fact. This observation must be limited exclusively to his daughter. As to Tom, he was becoming that not unprecedented triumph of calculation which is usually at work on number 1. As to Mrs. Gradgrind, if she said anything on the subject, she would come a little way out of her wrappers, like a feminine dormouse, and say, "Good gracious, bless me, how my poor head is vexed and worried by that girl Jupe's so perseveringly asking over and over again about her tiresome letters. Upon my word and honour, I seem to be fated and destined and ordained to live in the midst of things that I am never to hear the last of. It really is a most extraordinary circumstance that appears as if I never was to hear the last of anything." At about this point Mr. Gradgrind's eye would fall upon her, and under the influence of that wintry piece of fact she would become torpid again. Chapter 10. Stephen Blackpool. I entertain a weak idea that the English people are as hard worked as any people upon whom the sun shines. I acknowledge to this ridiculous idiosyncrasy as a reason why I would give them a little more play. In the hardest working part of Coketown, in the innermost fortifications of that ugly citadel where nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in, at the heart of that labyrinth of narrow courts upon courts, and close streets upon streets, which had come into existence piecemeal, every piece in a violent hurry for some one man's purpose, and the whole an unnatural family, shouldering and trampling and pressing one another to death. In that last close nook of this great exhausted receiver, where the chimneys, for want of air to make a draught, were built in an immense variety of stunted and crooked shapes, as though every house put out a sign of the kind of people who might be expected to be born in it, among the multitude of Coketown generically called the Hands. a race who would have found more favour with some people if Providence had seen fit to make them only hands, or, like the lower creatures of the seashore, only hands and stomachs, lived a certain Stephen Blackpool, 40 years of age. Stephen looked older, but he had had a hard life. It is said that every life has its roses and thorns. There seemed, however, to have been a misadventure or mistake in Stephen's case, whereby somebody else had become possessed of his roses, and he had become possessed of that same somebody else's thorns in addition to his own. He had known, to use his words, a peck of trouble. He was usually called Old Stephen in a kind of rough homage to the fact. A rather stooping man, with a knitted brow, a pondering expression of face, and a hard-looking head sufficiently capacious on which his iron-grey hair lay long and thin, Old Stephen might have passed for a particularly intelligent man in his condition, yet he was not. He took no place among those remarkable hands who, piecing together their broken intervals of leisure through many years, had mastered difficult sciences and acquired a knowledge of most unlikely things. He held no station among the hands who could make speeches and carry on debates. Thousands of his compeers could talk much better than he at any time. He was a good power-loom weaver and a man of perfect integrity. What more he was, or what else he had in him, if anything, let him show for himself. The lights in the great factories, which looked, when they were illuminated, like fairy palaces, or the travellers by express train said so, were all extinguished, and the bells had rung for knocking off for the night, and had ceased again, and the hands, men and women, boy and girl, were clattering home. Old Stephen was standing in the street, with the odd sensation upon him which the stoppage of the machinery always produced, the sensation of its having worked and stopped in his own head. "Yet I don't see Rachael still," said he. It was a wet night, and many groups of young women passed him, with their shawls drawn over their bare heads and held close under their chins to keep the rain out. He knew Rachael well, for a glance at any one of those groups was sufficient to show him that she was not there. At last there was no more to come, and then he turned away, saying in a tone of disappointment, "Why, then, I have missed her." But he had not gone the length of 3 streets when he saw another of the shawled figures in advance of him, at which he looked so keenly that perhaps its mere shadow, indistinctly reflected on the wet pavement, if he could have seen it without the figure itself, moving along from lamp to lamp, brightening and fading as it went, would have been enough to tell him who was there. Making his pace at once much quicker and much softer, he darted on until he was very near this figure, then fell into his former walk and called, "Rachael!" She turned, being then in the brightness of a lamp, and raising her hood a little, showed a quiet oval face, dark and rather delicate, irradiated by a pair of very gentle eyes, and further set off by the perfect order of her shining black hair. It was not a face in its first bloom. She was a woman 35 years of age. "Ah, lad, 'tis thou." When she had said this, with a smile which would have been quite expressed, though nothing of her had been seen but her pleasant eyes, she replaced her hood again, and they went on together. "I thought thou was ahind me, Rachael." "No." "Early to-night, lass?" "Times I'm a little early, Stephen, times a little late. I'm never to be counted on going home." "Nor going t'other way neither, it seems to me, Rachael." "No, Stephen." He looked at her with some disappointment in his face, but with a respectful and patient conviction that she must be right in whatever she did. The expression was not lost upon her. She laid her hand lightly on his arm a moment, as if to thank him for it. "We are such true friends, lad, and such old friends, and getting to be such old folk now." "No, Rachel, thou'rt as young as ever thou wast." "One of us would be puzzled how to get old, Stephen, without t'other getting so too, both being alive," she answered, laughing. "But anyways, we're such old friends, that to hide a word of honest truth fro one another would be a sin and a pity. 'Tis better not to walk too much farther. Times, yes, 'twould be hard indeed if 'twas not to be at all," she said with a cheerfulness she sought to communicate to him. "'Tis hard anyways, Rachel." "Try to think not, and 'twill seem better." "I've tried a long time, and 'tain't got better. But thou'rt right to make folk talk even of thee. Thou hast been that to me, Rachel. Through so many year thou hast done me so much good, and heartened of me in that cheering way, that thy word is law to me. Ah, lass, and a bright good law, better than some real ones." "Oh, never fret about them, Stephen," she answered quickly, and not without an anxious glance at his face. "Let the laws be." "Yes," he said, with a slow nod or two. "Let 'em be. Let everything be. Let all sorts alone. 'Tis a muddle, and that's all." "Always a muddle?" said Rachel, with another gentle touch upon his arm, as if to recall him out of the thoughtfulness in which he was biting the long ends of his loose neckerchief as he walked along. The touch had its instantaneous effect. He let them fall. Turning a smiling face upon her, he said, as he broke into a good-humoured laugh, "Ay, Rachel, less. All is a muddle. That's where I stick. I come to the muddle many times and again, and I never get beyond it." They had walked some distance, and were near their own homes. The woman's was the first reach. It was in one of the many small streets for which the favourite undertaker, who turned a handsome sum out of the poor ghastly pomp of the neighbourhood, kept a black ladder, in order that those who had done their daily groping up and down the narrow streets might slide out of this working world by the windows. She stopped at the corner, and putting her hand in his, wished him good night. "Good night, dear lass. Good night." She went with her neat figure and her sober womanly step down the dark street, and he stood looking after her until she turned into one of the small houses. There was not a flutter of her coarse shawl, perhaps, but had its interest in this man's eyes, not a tone of her voice, but had its echo in his innermost heart. When she was lost to his view, he pursued his homeward way, glancing up sometimes to the sky, where the clouds were sailing fast and wildly. But they were broken now, and the rain had ceased, and the moon shone, looking down the high chimneys of Coketown on the deep furnaces below, and casting titanic shadows of the steam engines at rest upon the walls where they were lodged. The man seemed to have brightened with the night as he went on. His home, in such another street as the first, saving that it was narrower, was over a little shop. How it came to pass that any people found it worth their while to sell or buy the wretched little toys mixed up in its window with cheap newspapers and pork (there was a leg to be raffled for tomorrow night), matters not here. He took his end of candle from a shelf, lighted it at another end of candle on the counter without disturbing the mistress of the shop, who was asleep in her little room, and went upstairs into his lodging. It was a room not unacquainted with the black ladder under various tenants, but as neat at present as such a room could be. A few books and writings were on an old bureau in a corner. The furniture was decent and sufficient, and though the atmosphere was tainted, the room was clean. Going to the hearth, he set the candle down upon the round, three-legged table standing there. He stumbled against something as he recoiled, looking down at it. It raised itself up into the form of a woman in sitting attitude. "Heavens, mercy, woman!" he cried, falling farther off from the figure. "Hast thou come back again?" Such a woman! A disabled, drunken creature, barely able to preserve her sitting posture by steadying herself with one begrimed hand on the floor, while the other was so purposeless as trying to push away her tangled hair from her face that it only blinded her the more with the dirt upon it. A creature so foul to look at, in her tatters, stains, and splashes, but so much fouler than that in her moral infamy, that it was a shameful thing even to see her. After an impatient oath or two, and some stupid clawing at herself with a hand not necessary to her support, she got her hair away from her eyes sufficiently to obtain a sight of him. Then she sat swaying her body to and fro, and making gestures with her unnerved arm, which seemed intended as the accompaniment to a fit of laughter, though her face was stolid and drowsy. "Ithleth, what you're there?" Some hoarse sounds meant for this came mockingly out of her at last, and her head dropped forward on her breast. "Back again?" she screeched after some minutes, as if he had that moment said it. "Yes, and back again, ever and ever so often. Back, yes, back, why not?" Roused by the unmeaning voice with which she cried it out, she scrambled up and stood supporting herself with her shoulders against the wall, dangling in one hand by the string of a dunghill fragment of a bonnet, and trying to look scornfully at him. "I'll sell thee off again, I'll sell thee off again, I'll sell thee off a score of times," she cried, with something between a furious menace and an effort at defiant dance. "Come awa' from the bed." He was sitting on the side of it with his face hidden in his hands. "Come awa' from 't. 'Tis mine, and I've a right to it." As she staggered to it, he avoided her with a shudder, and passed till his face was hidden, to the opposite end of the room. She threw herself upon the bed heavily, and soon was snoring hard. He sunk into a chair, and moved but once all that night. It was to throw a covering over her, as if his hands were not enough to hide her, even in the darkness. End of Section 5 of Hard Times.
Section 6 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Wills. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 6, Chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11. No Way Out. The fairy palaces burst into illumination before pale morning showed the monstrous serpents of smoke trailing themselves over Coketown. A clattering of clogs upon the pavement, a rapid ringing of bells, and all the melancholy mad elephants, polished and oiled up for the day's monotony, were at their heavy exercise again. Stephen bent over his loom, quiet, watchful, and steady. A special contrast, as every man was in the forest of looms where Stephen worked, to the crashing, smashing, tearing piece of mechanism at which he laboured. Never fear, good people of an anxious turn of mind, that art will consign nature to oblivion. Set anywhere, side by side, the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though it be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many hundred horse steam power. It is known to the force of a single pound weight what the engine will do, but not all the calculators of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue into vice or the reverse at any single moment in the soul of one of these its quiet servants, with the composed faces and the regulated actions. There is no mystery in it. There is an unfathomable mystery in the meanest of them, forever. Supposing we were to reverse our arithmetic for material objects, and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means. The day grew strong and showed itself outside, even against the flaming lights within. The lights were turned out, and the work went on. The rain fell, and the smoke serpents, submissive to the curse of all that tribe, trailed themselves upon the earth. In the waste yard outside, the steam from the escape pipe, the litter of barrels and old iron, the shining heaps of coals, the ashes everywhere, were shrouded in a veil of mist and rain. The work went on until the noon bell rang. More clattering upon the pavements, the looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. Stephen came out of the hot mill into the damp wind and cold wet streets, haggard and worn. He turned from his own class and his own quarter, taking nothing but a little bread as he walked along, towards the hill on which his principal employer lived, in a red house with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door up 2 white steps, Bounderby, in letters very like himself, upon a brazen plate, and a round brazen door handle underneath it, like a brazen full stop. Mr. Bounderby was at his lunch, so Stephen had expected. Would his servant say that one of the hands begged leave to speak to him? Message in return requiring name of such hand. Stephen Blackpool. There was nothing troublesome against Stephen Blackpool. Yes, he might come in. Stephen Blackpool in the parlour. Mr. Bounderby, whom he just knew by sight, at lunch on chop and sherry. Mrs. Sparset netting at the fireside, in a side-saddle attitude, with one foot in a cotton stirrup. It was a part at once of Mrs. Sparset's dignity and service not to lunch. She supervised the meal officially, but implied that in her own stately person she considered lunch a weakness. "Now, Stephen," said Mr. Bounderby, "what's the matter with you?" Stephen made a bow. "Not a servile one. These hands will never do that. Lord bless you, sir, you'll never catch them at that, if they have been with you 20 years. And, as a complimentary toilet for Mrs. Sparset, tucked his neckerchief ends into his waistcoat. "Now, you know," said Mr. Bounderby, taking some sherry, "we've never had any difficulty with you, and you've never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six, and to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, as a good many of them do." Mr. Bounderby always represented this to be the sole, immediate, and direct object of any hand who was not entirely satisfied. "And therefore I know already that you have not come here to make a complaint. Now you know, I am certain of that beforehand." "No, sir. Sure I ha' no come for nowt o' the kind." Mr. Bounderby seemed agreeably surprised, notwithstanding his previous strong conviction. "Very well," he returned. "You're a steady hand, and I was not mistaken. Now let me hear what it's all about. As it's not that, let me hear what it is. What have you got to say? Out with it, lad." Stephen happened to glance toward Mrs. Sparset. "I can go, Mr. Bounderby, if you wish it," said that self-sacrificing lady, making a feint of taking her foot out of the stirrup. Mr. Bounderby stayed her by holding a mouthful of chop in suspension before swallowing it, and putting out his left hand. Then, withdrawing his hand and swallowing his mouthful of chop, he said to Stephen, "Now you know, this good lady is a born lady, a high lady. You are not to suppose because she keeps my house for me that she hasn't been very high up the tree, up at the top of the tree. Now if you have got anything to say that can't be said before a born lady, this lady will leave the room. If what you have got to say can be said before a born lady, this lady will stay where she is." "Sir, I hope I never had nowt to say not fitting for a born lady to hear, seeing I were born mysen," was the reply, accompanied with a slight flush. "Very well," said Mr. Bounderby, pushing away his plate and leaning back. "Fire away." "I ha' come," Stephen began, raising his eyes from the floor after a moment's consideration, "to ask you your advice. I need it o'ermuch. I were married on Easter Monday 19 years sin, Longandry. She were a young lass, pretty enow, wi' good accounts of herseln. Well, she went bad, soon. Not along o' me. God knows I were not an unkind husband to her." "I have heard all this before," said Mr. Bounderby. "She took to drinking, left off working, sold the furniture, pawned the clothes, and played old gooseberry." "I were patient wi' her." "The more fool you, I think," said Mr. Bounderby, in confidence to his wine-glass. I were very patient wi' her. I tried to wean her from it o'er and o'er again. I tried this, I tried that, I tried t'other. I ha' gone home many's the time and found all vanished as I had in the world, and her without a sense left to bless herself, lying on bare ground. I ha' done it not once, not twice, 20 time. Every line in his face deepened as he said it, and put in its affecting evidence of the suffering he had undergone. From bad to worse, from worse to worsen. She left me. She disgraced herself in every ways, bitter and bad. She come back. She come back. She come back. What could I do to hinder her? I ha' walked the streets nights long ere ever I'd go home. I ha' gone to the brig minded to fling myself o'er and have no more on't. I ha' bore that much that I were old when I were young. Mrs. Sparset, easily ambling along with her netting needles, raised the Coriolanian eyebrows and shook her head, as much as to say, "The great know trouble as well as the small. Please to turn your humble eye in my direction." I ha' paid her to keep away from me. These 5 year I ha' paid her. I ha' gotten decent futurals about me again. I ha' lived hard and sad, but not ashamed and fearful of the minutes of my life. Last night I went home. There she lay upon my hearthstone. There she is! In the strength of his misfortune and the energy of his distress, he fired for the moment like a proud man. In another moment he stood as he had stood all the time, his usual stoop upon him, his pondering face addressed to Mr. Bounderby, with a curious expression on it, half shrewd, half perplexed, as if his mind were set upon unravelling something very difficult. His hat held tight in his left hand, which rested on his hip. His right arm, with a rugged propriety and force of action, very earnestly emphasizing what he said, not least so when it always paused, a little bent but not withdrawn, as he paused. "I was acquainted with all this, you know," said Mr. Bounderby, "except the last clause, long ago. It's a bad job, that's what it is. You had better have been satisfied as you were, and not have got married. However, it is too late to say that." "Was it an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years?" asked Mrs. Sparset. "You hear what this lady asks. Was it an unequal marriage in point of years, this unlucky job of yours?" said Mr. Bounderby. "Not e'en so. I were 21 myseln. She were 29, but—" "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Sparset to her chief, with great placidity, "I inferred from its being so miserable a marriage, that it was probably an unequal one in point of years." Mr. Bounderby looked very hard at the good lady in a sidelong way that had an odd sheepishness about it. He fortified himself with a little more sherry. "Well, why don't you go on?" he then asked, turning rather irritably on Stephen Blackpool. "I ha' come to ask you, sir, how I am to be ridded of this woman." Stephen infused a yet deeper gravity into the mixed expression of his attentive face. Mrs. Sparset uttered a gentle ejaculation, as having received a moral shock. "What do you mean?" said Bounderby, getting up to lean his back against the chimney-piece. "What are you talking about? You took her for better or for worse?" "I must be ridden on her. I cannot bear it no more. I ha' lived under it so long, for that I hadn't the pity and comforting words of the best lass living or dead. Haply but for her, I should have gone battering mad." "He wishes to be free to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir," observed Mrs. Sparset in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people. "I do. The lady says what's right. I do. I were a-coming to it. I ha' read i' the papers that great folk, far fro' 'em all, I wishes 'em no hurt, are not bonded together for better for worse so fast, but that they can be set free fro' their misfort'nate marriages, and marry o'er again. When they dunnot agree, for that their tempers is ill sorted, they has rooms o' one kind and another in their houses, above a bit, and they can live asunders. We folk ha' only one room, and we can't. When that won't do, they ha' gowd another cash, and they can say, this for you and that for me, and they can go their separate ways. We can't. Spite o' all that, they can be set free for smaller wrongs than mine. So I mun be ridden of this woman, and I want to know how." "Know how?" returned Mr. Bounderby. "If I do her any hurt, sir, there's a law to punish me." "Of course there is." "If I flee from her, there's a law to punish me."
"Of course there is."
"If I marry t'other dear lass, there's a law to punish me."
"Of course there is."
"If I was to live wi' her, and not marry her, saying such a thing could be, which it never could or would in her so good, there's a law to punish me and every innocent child belonging to me."
"Of course there is."
"Now, in God's name," said Stephen Blackpool, "show me the law to help me." There's a sanctity in this relation of life, said Mr. Bounderby, and it must be kept up. No, no, do not say that, sir. 'Tain't kept up that way, not that way. 'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver. I were in a factory when a child, but I ha' got nine to see wi, and earn to hear wi. I read in the papers every sizes, every sessions, and you read too, I know it, with dismay, how the supposed unpossibility o' ever getting unchained from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death. Let us ha' this right understood. Mine's a grievous case, and I want, if you will be so good, to know the law that helps me. Now I tell you what, said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, there is such a law. Stephen, subsiding into his quiet manner, and never wandering in his attention, gave a nod. But it's not for you at all. It costs money. It costs a mint of money. How much might that be? Stephen calmly asked. Why, you'd have to go to a Doctor's Commons with a suit, and you'd have to go to a Court of Common Law with a suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with a suit, and you'd have to get an Act of Parliament to enable you to marry again, and it would cost you, if it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose from £1,000 to £1,500, said Mr. Bounderby. Perhaps twice the money. There's no other law. Certainly not. Why then, sir, said Stephen, turning white and motioning with that right hand of his, as if he gave everything to the four winds. 'Tis a muddle. 'Tis just a muddle altogether, and the sooner I'm dead the better. Mrs. Sparset, again dejected by the impiety of the people. Pooh, pooh, don't you talk nonsense, my good fellow, said Mr. Bounderby, about things you don't understand, and don't you call the institutions of your country a muddle, or you'll get yourself into a real muddle one of these fine mornings. The institutions of your country are not your piecework, and the only thing you have got to do is to mind your piecework. You didn't take your wife for fast and for loose, but for better and for worse. If she has turned out worse, why, all we've got to say is she might have turned out better. 'Tis a muddle, said Stephen, shaking his head as he moved to the door. 'Tis all a muddle. Now I'll tell you what, Mr. Bounderby resumed as a valedictory address. With what I shall call your unhallowed opinions, you have been quite shocking to this lady, who, as I have already told you, is a born lady, and who, as I have not already told you, has had her own marriage misfortunes to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. Tens of thousands of pounds! He repeated it with great relish. Now, you have always been a steady hand hitherto, but my opinion is, and so I tell you plainly, that you are turning into the wrong road. You have been listening to some mischievous stranger or other, they're always about, and the best thing you can do is to come out of that. Now you know, here his countenance expressed marvellous acuteness, I can see as far into a grindstone as another man, farther than a good many, perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I was young. I see traces of the turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this, yes I do, cried Mr. Bounderby, shaking his head with obstinate cunning. By the Lord Harry, I do. With a very different shake of his head and deep sigh, Stephen said, Thank you, sir. I wish you good day. So he left Mr. Bounderby swelling at his own portrait on the wall as if he were going to explode himself into it, and Mrs. Sparset still ambling on with her foot in her stirrup, looking quite cast down by the popular vices. Chapter 13. The Old Woman. Old Stephen descended the 2 white steps, shutting the black door with the brazen door-plate by the aid of the brazen full-stop, to which he gave a parting polish with the sleeve of his coat, observing that his hot hand clouded it. He crossed the street with his eyes bent upon the ground, and thus was walking sorrowfully away when he felt a touch upon his arm. It was not the touch he needed most at such a moment, the touch that could calm the wild waters of his soul as the uplifted hand of the sublimest love and patience could abate the raging of the sea. Yet it was a woman's hand, too. It was an old woman, tall and shapely still, though withered by time, on whom his eyes fell when he stopped and turned. She was very cleanly and plainly dressed, had country mud upon her shoes, and was newly come from a journey. The flutter of her manner in the unwonted noise of the streets, the spare shawl carried unfolded on her arm, the heavy umbrella and little basket, the loose long-fingered gloves to which her hands were unused, all bespoke an old woman from the country, in her plain holiday clothes, come into Coketown on an expedition of rare occurrence. Remarking this at a glance with the quick observation of his class, Stephen Blackpool bent his attentive face, his face which, like the faces of many of his order, by dint of long working with eyes and hands in the midst of a prodigious noise, had acquired the concentrated look with which we are familiar in the countenances of the deaf, the better to hear what she asked him. "Pray, sir," said the old woman, "didn't I see you come out of that gentleman's house?" pointing back to Mr. Bounderby's. "I believe it was you, unless I have had the bad luck to mistake the person in following." "Yes, missus," returned Stephen, "it were me." "Have you'll excuse an old woman's curiosity, have you seen the gentleman?" "Yes, missus." "And how did he look, sir? Was he portly, bold, outspoken, and hearty?" As she straightened her own figure and held up her head in adapting her action to her words, the idea crossed Stephen that he had seen this old woman before, and had not quite liked her. "Oh, yes," he returned, observing her more attentively. "He were all that." "And healthy," said the old woman, "as the fresh wind?" "Yes," returned Stephen. "He were eating and drinking, as large and as loud as a hummelbee." "Thank you," said the old woman, with infinite content. "Thank you." He certainly never had seen this old woman before, yet there was a vague remembrance in his mind, as if he had more than once dreamed of some old woman like her. She walked along at his side, and, gently accommodating himself to her humour, he said, Coketown was a busy place, was it not? To which she answered, "Aye, sure, dreadful busy." Then he said, she came from the country, he saw. To which she answered in the affirmative. "By Parliamentary, this morning. I came 40 mile by Parliamentary this morning, and I'm going back the same 40 mile this afternoon. I walked 9 mile to the station this morning, and if I find nobody on the road to give me a lift, I shall walk the 9 mile back tonight. That's pretty well, sir, at my age," said the chatty old woman, her eye brightening with exultation. "'Deed 'tis. Don't do it too often, missus." "No, no, once a year," she answered, shaking her head. "I spend my savings, sir, once every year. I come regular, to tramp about the streets and see the gentleman." "Only to see him?" returned Stephen. "That's enough for me," she replied, with great earnestness and interest of manner. "I ask no more. I have been standing about on this side of the way to see that gentleman," turning her head back towards Mr. Bounderby's again. "Come out. But he's late this year, and I've not seen him. You came out instead. Now, if I am obliged to go back without a glimpse of him, I only want a glimpse. Well, I have seen you, and you have seen him, and I must make that do." Saying this, she looked at Stephen as if to fix his features in her mind, and her eye was not so bright as it had been. With a large allowance for difference of tastes, and with all submission to the patricians of Coketown, this seemed so extraordinary a source of interest to take so much trouble about, that it perplexed him. But they were passing the church now, and as his eye caught the clock, he quickened his pace. He was going to work, the old woman said, quickening hers too, quite easily. Yes, time was nearly out. On his telling her where he worked, the old woman became a more singular old woman than before. "Aren't you happy?" she asked him. "Why, there's almost nobody but has their troubles, missus," he answered evasively, because the old woman appeared to take it for granted that he would be very happy indeed, and he had not the heart to disappoint her. He knew that there was trouble enough in the world, and if the old woman had lived so long and could count upon his having so little, why so much the better for her, and none the worse for him. "Aye, aye, you have your troubles at home, you mean," she said. "Times, just now and then," he answered slightly. "But working under such a gentleman, they don't follow you to the factory." "No, no, they didn't follow him there," said Stephen. "All correct there. Everything accordant there. He did not go so far as to say for her pleasure that there was a sort of divine right there, but I have heard claims almost as magnificent of late years." They were now in the back by-road near the place, and the hands were crowding in. The bell was ringing, and the serpent was a serpent of many coils, and the elephant was getting ready. The strange old woman was delighted with the very bell. It was the beautifullest bell she had ever heard, she said, and sounded grand. She asked him, when he stopped good-naturedly to shake hands with her before going in, how long he had worked there. "A dozen year," he told her. "I must kiss the hand," said she, "that has worked in this fine factory for a dozen year." And she lifted it, though he would have prevented her, and put it to her lips. What harmony besides her age and her simplicity surrounded her he did not know, but even in this fantastic action there was a something neither out of time nor place, a something which it seemed as if nobody else could have made as serious, or done with such a natural and touching air. He had been at his loom full half an hour, thinking about this old woman, when, having occasion to move round the loom for its adjustment, He glanced through a window which was in his corner, and saw her still looking up at the pile of building, lost in admiration. Heedless of the smoke and mud and wet, and of her 2 long journeys, she was gazing at it, as if the heavy thrum that issued from its many stories were proud music to her. She was gone by and by, and the day went after her, and the lights sprung up again, and the express whirled in full sight of the fairy palace over the arches near, little felt amid the jarring of the machinery, and scarcely heard above its crash and rattle. Long before then his thoughts had gone back to the dreary room above the little shop, and to the shameful figure heavy on the bed, but heavier on his heart. Machinery slackened, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse, stopped. The bell again, the glare of light and heat dispelled, the factories looming heavy in the black wet night, their tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel. He had spoken to Rachael only last night, it was true, and had walked with her a little way, but he had his new misfortune on him in which no one else could give him a moment's relief, and for the sake of it, and because he knew himself to want that softening of his anger which no voice but hers could effect, he felt he might so far disregard what she had said as to wait for her again. He waited, but she had eluded him. She was gone. On no other night in the year could he so ill have spared her patient face. Oh, better to have no home in which to lay his head, than to have a home and dread to go to it through such a cause. He ate and drank, for he was exhausted, but he little knew or cared what, and he wandered about in the chill rain, thinking and thinking, and brooding and brooding. No word of a new marriage had ever passed between them, but Rachael had taken great pity on him years ago, and to her alone he had opened his closed heart all this time, on the subject of his miseries, and he knew very well that if he were free to ask her, she would take him. He thought of the home he might at that moment have been seeking with pleasure and pride, of the different man he might have been that night, of the lightness then in his now heavy-laden breast, of the then restored honour, self-respect, and tranquillity, all torn to pieces. He thought of the waste of the best part of his life, of the change it made in his character for the worst every day, of the dreadful nature of his existence, bound hand and foot to a dead woman and tormented by a demon in her shape. He thought of Rachael, how young when they were first brought together in these circumstances, how mature now, how soon to grow old. He thought of the number of girls and women she had seen marry, how many homes with children in them she had seen grow up around her, how she had contentedly pursued her own lone quiet path, for him, and how he had sometimes seen a shade of melancholy on her blessed face, that smote him with remorse and despair. He set the picture of her up beside the infamous image of last night, and thought, could it be that the whole earthly course of one so gentle, good, and self-denying, was subjugate to such a wretch as that? Filled with these thoughts, so filled that he had an unwholesome sense of growing larger, of being placed in some new and diseased relation towards the objects among which he passed, of seeing the iris round every misty light turn red, he went home for shelter. End of section 6.
Section 7 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 13. Rachael. A candle faintly burned in the window to which the black ladder had often been raised for the sliding away of all that was most precious in this world to a striving wife and a brood of hungry babies, and Stephen added to his other thoughts the stern reflection that of all the casualties of his existence upon earth, not one was dealt out with so unequal a hand as death. The inequality of birth was nothing to it, for say that the child of a king and the child of a weaver were born tonight in the same moment. What was that disparity to the death of any human creature who was serviceable to or beloved by another, while this abandoned woman lived on? From the outside of his house he gloomily passed to the inside with suspended breath and with a slow footstep. He went up to his door, opened it, and so into the room. Quiet and peace were there. Rachel was there, sitting by the bed. She turned her head, and the light of her face shone in upon the midnight of his mind. She sat by the bed, watching and tending his wife. That is to say, he saw that someone lay there, and he knew too well it must be she. But Rachel's hands had put a curtain up so that she was screened from his eyes. Her disgraceful garments were removed, and some of Rachel's were in the room. Everything was in its place and order as he'd always kept it. The little fire was newly trimmed, and the hearth was freshly swept. It appeared to him that he saw all this in Rachel's face, and looked at nothing besides. While looking at it, it was shut out from his view by the softened tears that filled his eyes, but not before he had seen how earnestly she looked at him, and how her own eyes were filled too. She turned again towards the bed, and, satisfying herself that all was quiet there, spoke in a low, calm, cheerful voice. "I'm glad you have come at last, Stephen. You are very late." "I have been walking up and down." "I thought so. But 'tis too bad a night for that. The rain falls very heavy, and the wind has risen." The wind? True. It was blowing hard. Hark to the thundering in the chimney and the surging noise. To have been out in such a wind and not to have known it was blowing. "I have been here once before today, Stephen. Landlady came round for me at dinner time. There was someone here that needed looking to, she said. Indeed, she was right. All wandering and lost, Stephen. Wounded too and bruised." He slowly moved to a chair and sat down, drooping his head before her. "I came to do what little I could, Stephen. First, for that she worked with me when we were girls both, and for that you courted her and married her when I was her friend." He laid his furrowed forehead on his hand with a low groan. "And next, for that I know your heart, and am right sure and certain that 'tis far too merciful to let her die, or even so much as suffer for want of aid. Thou knowest who said, 'Let him who is without sin amongst you cast the first stone at her.' There have been plenty to do that. Thou art not a man to cast the last stone, Stephen, when she is brought so low. Oh, Rachel, Rachel! Thou hast been a cruel sufferer, heaven reward thee," she said in compassionate accents. "I am thy poor friend with all my heart and mind." The wounds of which she had spoken seemed to be about the neck of the self-made outcast. She dressed them now, still without showing her. She steeped a piece of linen in a basin, into which she poured some liquid from a bottle, and laid it with a gentle hand upon the sore. The three-legged table had been drawn close to the bedside, and on it there were 2 bottles. This was one. It was not so far off but that Stephen, following her hands with his eyes, could read what was printed on it in large letters. He turned of a deadly hue, and a sudden horror seemed to fall upon him. "I will stay here, Stephen," said Rachel, quietly resuming her seat, "till the bells go 3. 'Tis to be done again at 3, and then she may be left till morning." "But thy rest again tomorrow's work, my dear." "I slept sound last night. I can wake many nights when I am put to it. 'Tis thou who art in need of rest, so white and tired. Try to sleep in the chair there while I watch. Thou hadst no sleep last night, I can well believe. Tomorrow's work is far harder for thee than for me." He heard the thundering and surging out of doors, and it seemed to him as if his late angry mood were going about trying to get at him. She had cast it out. She would keep it out. He trusted to her to defend him from himself. "She don't know me, Stephen. She just drowsily mutters and stares. I've spoken to her at time and again, but she don't notice. 'Tis well so. When she comes to her right mind once more, I shall have done what I can, and she never the wiser. How long, Rachel, is looked for that she'll be so? Doctor said she would happily come to her mind tomorrow. His eyes again fell on the bottle, and a tremble passed over him, causing him to shiver in every limb. She thought he was chilled with the wet. No, he said, it was not that. He'd had a fright. A fright? Aye, coming in. When I were walking, when I were thinking, It seized him again, and he stood up, holding by the mantel-shelf, as he pressed his dank, cold hair down with a hand that shook as if it were palsied. Stephen! She was coming to him, but he stretched out his arm to stop her. No, don't, please, don't. Let me see thee sitting by the bed. Let me see thee so good and so forgiving. Let me see thee as I see thee when I come in. I can never see thee better than so. Never, never, never. He had a violent fit of trembling, and then sunk into his chair. After a time he controlled himself, and, resting with an elbow on one knee, and his head upon that hand, he could look toward Rachel's. Seen across the dim candle with his moistened eyes, she looked as if she had a glory shining round her head. He could have believed she had. He did believe it, as the noise without shook the window, rattled at the door below, and went about the house clamouring and lamenting. When she gets better, Stephen, 'tis to be hoped she'll leave thee to thyself again, and do thee no more hurt. Anyways, we will hope so now. And now I shall keep silence, for I want thee to sleep. He closed his eyes, more to please her than to rest his weary head. But by slow degrees, as he listened to the great noise of the wind, he ceased to hear it, or it changed into the working of his loom, or even into the voices of the day, his own included, saying what had been really said. Even this imperfect consciousness faded away at last, and he dreamed a long, troubled dream. He thought that he and someone on whom his heart had long been set, but she was not Rachel, and that surprised him, even in the midst of his imaginary happiness, stood in the church being married. While the ceremony was performing, and while he recognized among the witnesses some whom he knew to be living, and many of whom he knew to be dead, darkness came on, succeeded by the shining of a tremendous light. It broke from one line in the table of commandments at the altar, and illuminated the building with the words. They were sounded through the church, too, as if they were voices in the fiery letters. Upon this the whole appearance before him and around him changed, and nothing was left as it had been but himself and the clergyman. They stood in the daylight before a crowd so vast that if all the people in the world could have been brought together into one space, they could not have looked, he thought, more numerous, and they all abhorred him, and there was not one pitying or friendly eye among the millions that were fastened on his face. He stood on a raised stage under his own loom, and, looking up at the shape the loom took, and hearing the burial service distinctly read, he knew that he was there to suffer death. In an instant what he stood on fell below him, and he was gone. Out of what mystery he came back to his usual life, and to places that he knew, he was unable to consider. But he was back in those places by some means, and with this condemnation upon him that he was never in this world or the next, through all the unimaginable ages of eternity, to look on Rachel's face or hear her voice. Wandering to and fro unceasingly without hope, and in search of he knew not what, he only knew that he was doomed to seek it, he was the subject of a nameless, horrible dread, a mortal fear of one particular shape which everything took. Whatsoever he looked at grew into that form sooner or later. The object of his miserable existence was to prevent its recognition by any one among the various people he encountered. Hopeless labour, if he led them out of rooms where it was, if he shut up drawers in closets where it stood, if he drew the curious from places where he knew it would be secreted, and got them out into the streets, the very chimneys of the mills assumed that shape, and round them was the printed word. The wind was blowing again. The rain was beating on the housetops, and the larger spaces through which he had strayed contracted to the four walls of his room. Saving that the fire had died out, it was as his eyes had closed upon it. Rachel seemed to have fallen into a doze in the chair by the bed. She sat wrapped in her shawl, perfectly still. The table stood in the same place, close by the bedside, and on it, in its real proportions and appearance, was a shape so often repeated. He thought he saw the curtain move. He looked again, and he was sure it moved. He saw a hand come forth and grope about a little. Then the curtain moved more perceptibly, and the woman in the bed put it back and sat up. With her woeful eyes so haggard and wild, so heavy and large, she looked all round the room, and past the corner where he slept in his chair. Her eyes returned to that corner, and she put her hand over them as a shade while she looked into it. Again they went all round the room, scarcely heeding Rachel, if at all, and returned to that corner. He thought, as she once more shaded them, not so much looking at him as looking for him, with a brutish instinct that he was there, that no single trace was left in those debauched features, or in the mind that went along with them, of the woman he had married 18 years before, but that he had seen her come to this by inches. He never could have believed her to be the same. All this time, as if a spell were on him, he was motionless and powerless, except to watch her. Stupidly dozing or communing with her incapable self, but nothing, she sat for a little while with her hands at her ears and her head resting on them. Presently she resumed her staring round the room, and now for the first time her eyes stopped at the table with the bottles on it. Straightway she turned her eyes back to his corner with the defiance of last night, and moving very cautiously and softly, stretched out her greedy hand. She drew a mug into the bed, and sat for a while considering which of the two bottles she should choose. Finally, she laid her insensate grasp upon the bottle that had swift and certain death in it, and before his eyes pulled out the cork with her teeth. Dream or reality, he had no voice, nor had he the power to stir. If this be real, and her allotted time be not yet come, wake, Rachel, wake. She thought of that, too. She looked at Rachel, and very slowly, very cautiously, poured out the contents. The draught was at her lips. A moment, and she would be past all help. Let the whole world wake and come about her with its utmost power. But in that moment Rachel stirred, and started up with a suppressed cry. The creature struggled, struck her, seized her by the hair, but Rachel had the cup. Stephen broke out of his chair. "Rachel, am I waking or dreaming this dreadful night?" "'Tis all well, Stephen. I have been asleep myself. 'Tis near 3. Hush, I hear the bells." The wind had brought the sounds of the church clock to the window. They listened, and it struck 3. Stephen looked at her, saw how pale she was, noted the disorder of her hair, and the red marks of fingers on her forehead. He felt assured that his senses of sight and hearing had been awake. She held the cup in her hand, even now. "I thought it must be near 3, she said calmly, pouring from the cup into the basin and steeping the linen as before. "I am thankful I stayed. 'Tis done now, and I have put this on. There, and now she's quiet again. The few drops in the basin I'll pour away, for 'tis bad stuff to leave about, though ever so little of it, As she spoke, she drained the basin into the ashes of the fire and broke the bottle on the hearth. She had nothing to do then but to cover herself with her shawl before going out into the wind and rain. "Thou let me walk with thee at this hour, Rachel?" "No, Stephen. 'Tis but a minute, and I am home." "Thou'rt no fearful," he said in a low voice, as they went out at the door, "to leave me alone with her?" As she looked at him, saying, "Stephen," he went down on his knee before her, on the poor mean stairs, and put an end of her shawl to his lips. "Thou art an angel. Bless thee, bless thee." "I am as I have told thee, Stephen, thy poor friend. Angels are not like me. Between them and a working woman full of faults there is a deep gulf set. My little sister is among them, but she is changed." She raised her eyes for a moment as she said the words, and then they fell again, in all their gentleness and mildness, on his face. "Thou changest me from bad to good. Thou makest me humbly wishful to be more like thee, and fearful to lose thee when this life is ours, and a muddle cleared away. Thou'rt an angel. It may be thou hast saved my soul alive." She looked at him on his knee at her feet, with her shawl still in his hand, and the reproof on her lips died away when she saw the working of his face. "I come home desperate. I come home without a hope, and mad with thinking that when I said a word or complaint I was reckoned a unreasonable hand. I told thee I had had a fright. It was the poison bottle on the table. I never hurt a living creature, but happening so suddenly upon it, I throwed. How can I say what I might have done to myself or her, or both?" She put her two hands on his mouth, with a face of terror, to stop him from saying more. He caught them in his unoccupied hand, and holding them, and still clasping the border of her shawl, said hurriedly, "But I see thee, Rachel, setting by the bed, and I have seen thee all this night in my troublous sleep, and I had known thee still to be there. Evermore I will see thee there. I nevermore will see her or think of her, but thou shalt be beside her. I nevermore will see or think of anything that angers me, but thou, or so much better than me, shalt be by the side on't. And so I will try to look to the time, and so I will try to trust in the time when thou and me at last shall walk together far away, beyond the deep gulf in the country where thy little sister is." He kissed the border of her shawl again, and let her go. She bade him good night in a broken voice, and went out into the street. The wind blew from the quarter where the day would soon appear, and still blew strongly. It had cleared the sky before it, and the rain had spent itself, or travelled elsewhere, and the stars were bright. He stood bareheaded in the road, watching her quick disappearance. As the shining stars were to the heavy candle in the window, so was Rachel in the rugged fancy of this man to the common experiences of his life. Chapter 14. The Great Manufacturer. Time went on in Coketown like its own machinery. So much material wrought up, so much fuel consumed, so many powers worn out, so much money made, but less inexorable than iron, steel, and brass. It brought its varying seasons even into that wilderness of smoke and brick, and made the only stand that was ever made in the place against its direful uniformity. "Louisa is becoming," said Mr. Gradgrind, "almost a young woman. Time, with his innumerable horsepower, worked away, not minding what anybody said, and presently turned out young Thomas a foot taller than when his father had last taken particular notice of him. "Thomas is becoming," said Mr. Gradgrind, "almost a young man." Time passed Thomas on in the mill, while his father was thinking about it, and there he stood in a long-tailed coat and a stiff shirt-collar. "Really," said Mr. Gradgrind, "the period has arrived when Thomas ought to go to Bounderby." Time, sticking to him, passed him on into Bounderby's bank, made him an inmate of Bounderby's house, necessitated the purchase of his first razor, and exercised him diligently in his calculations relative to number 1. The same great manufacturer, always with an immense variety of work on hand in every stage of development, passed Sissy onward in his mill, and worked her up into a very pretty article indeed. "I fear, Jupe," said Mr. Gradgrind, "that your continuance at the school any longer would be useless." "I'm afraid it would, sir," Sissy answered with a curtsy. "I cannot disguise from you, Jupe," said Mr. Gradgrind, knitting his brow, "that the result of your probation there has disappointed me, has greatly disappointed me. You have not acquired, under Mr. and Mrs. Coketown, anything like that amount of exact knowledge which I looked for. You are extremely deficient in your facts. Your acquaintance with figures is limited. You are altogether backward and below the mark." "I am sorry, sir," she returned, "but I know it is quite true, yet I have tried hard, sir." "Yes," said Mr. Gradgrind, "yes, I believe you have tried hard. I have observed you, and I can find no fault in that respect." "Thank you, sir. I have thought sometimes," Sissy, very timid here, "that perhaps I tried to learn too much, and that if I'd asked to be allowed to try a little less, I might have—" "No, Jupe, no," said Mr. Gradgrind, shaking his head in his profoundest, most eminently practical way. "No. The course you pursued according to the system, and there is no more to be said about it. I can only suppose that the circumstances of your early life were too unfavourable to the development of your reasoning powers, and that we began too late. Still, as I have said already, I am disappointed." "I wish I could have made a better acknowledgment, sir, of your kindness to a poor forlorn girl, who had no claim upon you, and of your protection of her." "Don't shed tears," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Don't shed tears. I don't complain of you. You are an affectionate, earnest, good young woman, and we must make that do." "Thank you, sir, very much," said Sissy, with a grateful curtsy. "You are useful to Mrs. Gradgrind, and in a generally pervading way. You are serviceable in the family also, so I understand from Miss Louisa, and indeed so I have observed myself. I therefore hope," said Mr. Gradgrind, "that you can make yourself happy in those relations." "I should have nothing to wish, sir, if—" "I understand you," said Mr. Gradgrind. "You still refer to your father. I have heard from Miss Louisa that you still preserve that bottle. Well, if your training in the service of arriving at exact results had been more successful, you would have been wiser on these points. I will say no more." He really liked Sissy too well to have contempt for her. Otherwise, he held her calculating powers in such very slight estimation that he must have fallen upon that conclusion. Somehow or other he'd become possessed by an idea that there was something in this girl which could hardly be set forth in a tabular form. Her capacity or definition might be easily stated at a very low figure, her mathematical knowledge at nothing, yet he was not sure that if he had been required, for example, to take her off into columns in a parliamentary return, he would have quite known how to divide her. In some stages of his manufacture of the human fabric, the processes of time are very rapid, young Thomas and Sissy being both at such a stage of their working up. These changes were effected in a year or two, while Mr. Gradgrind himself seemed stationary in his course and underwent no alteration. Oh, except one which was apart from his necessary progress through the mill. Time hustled him into a little noisy, rather dirty machinery in a by-corner, and made him Member of Parliament for Coketown, one of the respected members for ounce weights and measures, one of the representatives of the multiplication table, one of the deaf honourable gentlemen, dumb honourable gentlemen, blind honourable gentlemen, lame honourable gentlemen, dead honourable gentlemen, to every other consideration. Else wherefore live we in a Christian land 1800 and odd years after our Master? All this while Louisa had been passing on, so quiet and reserved, and so much given to watching the bright ashes at twilight as they fell from the grate and become extinct, that from the period when her father had said she was almost a young woman, which seemed but yesterday, she had scarcely attracted his notice again, when he found her quite a young woman. "Quite a young woman," said Mr. Gradgrind, musing. "Dear me!" Soon after this discovery he became more thoughtful than usual for several days, and seemed much engrossed by one subject. On a certain night, when he was going out, and Louisa came to bid him good-bye before his departure, as he was not to be home until late, and she would not see him again until the morning, he held her in his arms, looking at her in his kindest manner, and said, "My dear Louisa, you are a woman." She answered with an odd, quick, searching look of the night when she was found at the circus, then cast down her eyes. "Yes, father." "My dear," said Mr. Gradgrind, "I must speak with you alone and seriously. Come to me in my room after breakfast tomorrow, will you?" "Yes, father." "Your hands are rather cold, Louisa. Are you not well?" "Quite well, father." "And cheerful?" She looked at him again and smiled in her peculiar manner. "I am as cheerful, father, as I usually am, or usually have been." "Ah, that's well," said Mr. Gradgrind. So he kissed her and went away, and Louisa returned to the serene apartment of the hair-cutting character, and, leaning her elbow on her hand, looked again at the short-lived sparks that soon subsided into ashes. "Are you there, Lou?" said her brother, looking in at the door. He was quite a young gentleman of pleasure now, and not quite prepossessing one. "Dear Tom," she answered, rising and embracing him, "how long it is since you have been to see me!" "Why, I have been otherwise engaged, Lou. In the evenings and in the daytime old Bounderby has been keeping me at it rather, but I touch him up with you when he comes it too strong, and so we preserve an understanding. I say, has father said anything in particular to you today or yesterday, Lou?" "No, Tom, but he told me tonight that he wished to do so in the morning." "Ah, that's what I mean," said Tom. "Do you know where he is tonight?" With a very deep expression. "No." "Then I'll tell you. He's with old Bounderby. They are having a regular confab together at the bank." "What, at the bank, do you think? Well, I'll tell you again. To keep Mrs Sparset's ears as far off as possible, I expect." With her hand upon her brother's shoulder, Louisa stood looking at the fire. Her brother glanced at her face with greater interest than usual, and, encircling her waist with his arm, drew her coaxingly to him. "You are very fond of me, ain't you, Lou?" "I am indeed, Tom, though you do let such long intervals go by without coming to see me." "Well, sister of mine," said Tom, "when you say that, you are near my thoughts. We might be so much oftener together, mightn't we? Always together, almost, mightn't we? It would do me a great deal of good if you were to make up your mind to I know what, Lou. It would be a splendid thing for me. It would be uncommonly jolly." Her thoughtfulness baffled his cunning scrutiny. He could make nothing of her face. He pressed her in his arm and kissed her cheek. She returned the kiss, but still looked at the fire. "I say, Lou, I thought I'd come and just hint to you what was going on, though I suppose you'd most likely guess, even if you didn't know. I can't stay, because I'm engaged to some fellows tonight. You won't forget how fond you are of me?" "No, dear Tom, I won't forget." "That's a capital girl," said Tom. "Goodbye, Lou." She gave him an affectionate good night, and went out with him to the door, whence the fires of Coketown could be seen, making the distance lurid. She stood there looking steadfastly towards them, and listening to his departing steps. They retreated quickly, as glad to get away from Stone Lodge as she stood there yet, when he was gone and all was quiet. It seemed as if, first in her own fire within the house, and then in the fiery haze without, she tried to discover what kind of woof old Time, that greatest and longest established spinner of all, would weave from the threads he had already spun into a woman. But his factory is a secret place, his work is noiseless, and his hands are mutes. End of section 7 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 8 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 15. Father and Daughter. Although Mr. Gradgrind did not take after Bluebeard, his room was quite a blue chamber in its abundance of blue books. Whatever they could prove, which is usually anything you like, they proved there in an army constantly strengthening by the arrival of new recruits. In that charm department, the most complicated social questions were cast up, got into exact totals, and finally settled, if those concerned could only have been brought to know it. As if an astronomical observatory should be made without any windows, and the astronomer within should arrange the starry universe solely by pen and ink and paper, so Mr. Gradgrind in his observatory, and there are many like it, had no need to cast an eye upon the teeming myriads of human beings around him, but could settle all their destinies on a slate, and wipe out all their tears with one dirty little bit of sponge. To this observatory, then, a stern room with a deadly statistical clock in it which measured every second with a beat like a rap upon a coffin lid, Louisa repaired on the appointed morning. A window looked towards Coketown, and when she sat down near her father's table she saw the high chimneys and the long tracks of smoke looming in the heavy distance gloomily. "My dear Louisa," said her father, "I prepared you last night to give me your serious attention in the conversation we are now going to have together. You have been so well trained, and you do, I'm happy to say, so much justice to the education you have received, that I have perfect confidence in your good sense. You are not impulsive, you are not romantic. You are accustomed to view everything from the strong, dispassionate ground of reason and calculation. From that ground alone, I know you will view and consider what I am going to communicate." He waited as if he would have been glad that she said something, but she said never a word. "Louisa, my dear, you are the subject of a proposal of marriage that has been made to me." Again he waited, and again she answered not one word. This so far surprised him as to induce him gently to repeat, "A proposal of marriage, my dear?" To which she returned without any visible emotion whatever. "I hear you, father. I'm attending, I assure you." "Well," said Mr. Gradgrind, breaking into a smile after being for a moment at a loss, "you are even more dispassionate than I expected, Louisa, or perhaps you are not unprepared for the announcement I have it in my charge to make." "I cannot say that, father, until I hear it, prepared or unprepared. I wish to hear it all from you. I wish to hear you state it to me, father." Strange to relate, Mr. Gradgrind was not so collected at this moment as his daughter was. He took a paper knife in his hand, turned it over, laid it down, took it up again, and even then had to look along the blade of it, considering how to go on. "What you say, my dear Louisa, is perfectly reasonable. I have undertaken, then, to let you know that, in short, Mr. Bounderby has informed me that he has long watched your progress with particular interest and pleasure, and has long hoped that the time might ultimately arrive when he should offer you his hand in marriage. That time, to which he has so long, and certainly with great constancy, looked forward, is now come. Mr. Bounderby has made his proposal of marriage to me, and has entreated me to make it known to you, and to express his hope that you will take it into your favourable consideration." Silence between them. The deadly statistical clock very hollow, the distant smoke very black and heavy. "Father," said Louisa, "do you think I love Mr. Bounderby?" Mr. Gradgrind was extremely discomfited by this unexpected question. "Well, my child," he returned, "I really cannot take upon myself to say." "Father," pursued Louisa, in exactly the same voice as before, "do you ask me to love Mr. Bounderby?" "My dear Louisa, no, I ask nothing." "Father," she still pursued, "does Mr. Bounderby ask me to love him?" "Really, my dear," said Mr. Gradgrind, "it is difficult to answer your question." "Difficult to answer it, yes or no, father?" "Certainly, my dear, because—" Here was something to demonstrate, and it set him up again. "Because the reply depends so materially, Louisa, on the sense in which we use the expression. Now, Mr. Bounderby does not do you the injustice, and does not do himself the injustice, of pretending to anything fanciful, fantastic, or, I'm using synonymous terms, sentimental. Mr. Bounderby would have seen you grow up under his eyes to a very little purpose, if he could so far forget what is due to your good sense, not to say to his, as to address you from any such ground. Therefore, perhaps, the expression itself, I merely suggest this to you, my dear, may be a little misplaced." "What would you advise me to use in its stead, father?" "Why, my dear Louisa," said Mr. Gradgrind, completely recovered by this time, "I would advise you, since you ask me, to consider this question as you have been accustomed to consider every other question, simply as one of tangible fact. The ignorant and the giddy may embarrass such subjects with irrelevant fancies and other absurdities that have no existence properly viewed, really no existence, but it is no compliment to you to say that you know better. Now, what the facts are in this case, you are, we will say in round numbers, 20 years of age. Mr. Bounderby is, we will say in round numbers, 50. There is some disparity in your respective years, but in your means and positions there is none. On the contrary, there is a great suitability. Then the question arises, is this one disparity sufficient to operate as a bar to such a marriage? In considering this question, it is not unimportant to take into account the statistics of marriage, so far as they have yet been obtained in England and Wales. I find, on reference to the figures, that a large proportion of these marriages are contracted between parties of very unequal ages, and that the elder of these contracting parties is, in rather more than 3/4 of these instances, the bridegroom. It is remarkable as showing the wide prevalence of this law that among the natives of the British possessions in India, also in a considerable part of China, and among the Kalmucks in Tartary, the best means of computation yet furnished us by travellers yield similar results. The disparity I've mentioned, therefore, almost ceases to be disparity, and virtually all but disappears. "What do you recommend, father?" asked Louisa, her reserved composure not in the least affected by these gratifying results. "That I should substitute for the term I used just now, for the misplaced expression?" "Louisa," returned her father, "it appears to me that nothing can be plainer. Confining yourself rigidly to fact, the question of fact, you state to yourself, is, does Mr. Bounderby ask me to marry him? Yes, he does. The sole remaining question then is, shall I marry him? I think nothing can be plainer than that." "Shall I marry him?" repeated Louisa, with great deliberation. "Precisely, and it is satisfactory to me as your father, my dear Louisa, to know that you do not come to the consideration of that question with the previous habits of mind and habits of life that belong to many young women." "No, father," she returned, "I do not." "I leave you to judge for yourself," said Mr. Gradgrind. "I have stated the case as such cases are usually stated among practical minds. I have stated it as the case of your mother and myself was stated in its time. The rest, my dear Louisa, is for you to decide." From the beginning she had sat looking at him fixedly. As he now leaned back in his chair and bent his deep-set eyes upon her in his turn, perhaps he might have seen one wavering moment in her, when she was impelled to throw herself upon his breast and give him the pent-up confidences of her heart. But to see it he must have overleaped at a bound the artificial barriers he had for many years been erecting between himself and all those subtle essences of humanity which will elude the utmost cunning of algebra until the last trumpet ever to be sounded shall blow even algebra to wreck. The barriers were too many and too high for such a leap. With his unbending, utilitarian, matter-of-fact face, he hardened her again, and moment shot away into the plumbless depths of the past to mingle with all the lost opportunities that are drowned there. Removing her eyes from him, she sat so long looking silently towards the town that he said at length, "Are you consulting the chimneys of Coketown works, Louisa?" "Well, there seems to be nothing there but languid and monotonous smoke. Yet when night comes, fire bursts out, father," she answered, turning quickly. "Well, of course I know that, Louisa. I do not see the application of that remark. To do him justice, he did not at all. She passed it away with a slight motion of her hand, and concentrating her attention upon him again, said, "Father, I have often thought that life is very short." This was so distinctly one of his subjects that he interposed. "It is short, no doubt, my dear. Still, the average duration of human life is proved to have increased of late years, and the calculations of various life assurance and annuity offices, among other figures which cannot go wrong, have established the fact." "I speak of my own life, father." "Oh, indeed. Still," said Mr. Gradgrind, "I need not point out to you, Louisa, that it is governed by the laws which govern lives in the aggregate." "Whilst it lasts, I would wish to do the little I can and the little I am fit for. What does it matter?" Mr. Gradgrind seemed rather at a loss to understand the last 4 words, replying, "How matter? What matter, my dear?" "Mr. Bounderby," she went on, in a steady, straight way, without regarding this, "asks me to marry him. The question I have to ask myself is, shall I marry him? That is so, father, is it not? You have told me so, father, have you not?" "Oh, certainly, my dear." "Let it be so. Since Mr. Bounderby likes to take me thus, I am satisfied to accept his proposal. Tell him, father, as soon as you please, that this was my answer. Repeat it word for word, if you can, because I should wish him to know what I said." "Oh, it is quite right, my dear," retorted her father approvingly. "To be exact, I will observe your very proper request. Have you any wish in reference to the period of your marriage, my child?" "None, father. What does it matter?" Mr. Gradgrind had drawn his chair a little nearer to her, and taken her hand. But her repetition of these words seemed to strike with some little discord on his ear. He paused to look at her, and, still holding her hand, said, "Louisa, I have not considered it essential to ask you one question, because the possibility implied in it appeared to me to be too remote, but perhaps I ought to do so. You have never entertained in secret any other proposal?" "Father," she returned almost scornfully, "what other proposal can have been made to me? Whom have I seen? Where have I been? What are my heart's experiences?" "My dear Louisa," returned Mr. Gradgrind, reassured and satisfied, "you correct me justly. I merely wish to discharge my duty." "What do I know, father," said Louisa in her quiet manner, "of tastes and fantasies, of aspirations and affections, of all that part of my nature in which such light things might have been nourished? What escape have I had from problems that could be demonstrated, and realities that could be grasped?" As she said it, she unconsciously closed her hand as if upon a solid object, and slowly opened it as though she were releasing dust or ash. "My dear," assented her eminently practical parent, "quite true, quite true." "Why, father," she pursued, "what a strange question to ask me! The baby preference that even I have heard of as common among children has never had its innocent resting place in my breast. You have been so careful of me that I never had a child's heart. You have trained me so well that I never dreamed a child's dream. You have dealt so wisely with me, father, from my cradle to this hour, that I have never had a child's belief or a child's fear." Mr. Gradgrind was quite moved by his success, and by this testimony to it. "My dear Louisa," said he, "you abundantly repay my care. Kiss me, my dear girl." So his daughter kissed him. Detaining her in his embrace, he said, "I may assure you now, my favourite child, that I am made happy by the sound decision at which you have arrived. Mr. Bounderby is a very remarkable man, and what little disparity can be said to exist between you, if any, is more than counterbalanced by the tone your mind has acquired. It has always been my object so to educate you as that you might, while still in your early youth, be, if I may so express myself, almost any age. Kiss me once more, Louisa. Now let us go and find your mother." Accordingly they went down to the drawing-room, where the esteemed lady, with no nonsense about her, was recumbent as usual, while Sissy worked beside her. She gave some feeble signs of returning animation when they entered, and presently the faint transparency was presented in a sitting attitude. "Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband, who had waited for the achievement of this feat with some impatience, "allow me to present you Mrs. Bounderby." "Oh," said Mrs. Gradgrind, "so you have settled it. Well, I hope your health may be good, Louisa, for if your head begins to split as soon as you are married, which was the case with mine, I cannot consider that you are to be envied, though I have no doubt you think you are, as all girls do. However, I give you joy, my dear, and I hope you may now turn all your logical studies to good account. I'm sure I do. I must give you a kiss of congratulation, Louisa, but don't touch my right shoulder, for there's something running down it all day long. And now you see," whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, adjusting her shawls after the affectionate ceremony, "I shall be worrying myself morning, noon, and night to know what I am to call him." "Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband solemnly, "what do you mean?" "Whatever I am to call him, Mr. Gradgrind, when he is married to Louisa. I must call him something. It's impossible," said Mrs. Gradgrind, with a mingled sense of politeness and injury, "to be constantly addressing him and never giving him a name. I cannot call him Josiah, for the name is insupportable to me. You yourself wouldn't hear of Joe, you very well know. Am I to call my own son-in-law Mr.? Not that I believe, unless the time has arrived when, as an invalid, I am to be trampled upon by my relations. Then what am I to call him?" Nobody present having any suggestion to offer in the remarkable emergency, Mrs. Gradgrind departed this life for the time being, after delivering the following codicil to her remarks already executed. "As to the wedding, all I ask, Louisa, is, and I ask it with a flutter in my chest, what actually extends to the soles of my feet, that it may take place soon. Otherwise, I know it is one of those subjects I shall never hear the last of." When Mr. Gradgrind had presented Mrs. Bounderby, Sissy had suddenly turned her head and looked in wonder, in pity, in sorrow, in doubt, in a multitude of emotions toward Louisa. Louisa had known it and seen it without looking at her. From that moment she was impassive, proud, and cold, held Sissy at a distance, changed to her altogether. Chapter 16. Husband and Wife. Mr. Bounderby's first disquietude on hearing of his happiness was occasioned by the necessity of imparting it to Mrs. Sparset. He could not make up his mind how to do that, or what the consequences of the step might be. Whether she would instantly depart, bag and baggage, to Lady Scadger's, or would possibly refuse to budge from the premises, whether she would be plaintive or abusive, tearful or tearing, whether she would break her heart or break the looking-glass, Mr. Bounderby could not at all foresee. However, as it must be done, he had no choice but to do so. So, after attempting several letters and failing in them all, he resolved to do it by word of mouth. On his way home on the evening he set aside for this momentous purpose, he took the precaution of stepping into a chemist's shop and buying a bottle of the very strongest smelling salts. "By George," said Mr. Bounderby, "if she takes it in the fainting way, I'll have the skin off her nose at all events." But in spite of being thus forearmed, he entered his own house with anything but a courageous air, and appeared before the object of his misgivings like a dog who was conscious of coming direct from the pantry. "Good evening, Mr. Bounderby." "Good evening, ma'am, good evening." He drew up his chair, and Mrs. Sparset drew back hers, as who should say, "Your fireside, sir, I freely admit it. It is for you to occupy it all, if you think proper." "Oh, well, don't go to the North Pole, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby. "Thank you, sir," said Mrs. Sparset, and returned, though short of her former position. Mr. Bounderby sat looking at her as, with the points of a stiff, sharp pair of scissors, she picked out holes from some inscrutable ornamental purpose in a piece of cambric, an operation which, taken in connection with the bushy eyebrows and the Roman nose, suggested with some liveliness the idea of a hawk engaged upon the eyes of a tough little bird. She was so steadfastly occupied that many minutes elapsed before she looked up from her work. When she did so, Mr. Bounderby bespoke her attention with a hitch of his head. "Mrs. Sparset, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, and assuring himself with his right hand that the cork of the little bottle was ready for use, "I have on occasion to say to you that you are not only a lady born and bred, but a devilish sensible woman." "Sir," returned the lady, "this is indeed not the first time that you have honoured me with similar expressions of your good opinion." "Mrs. Sparset, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, "I am going to astonish you." "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset interrogatively, and in the most tranquil manner possible. She generally wore mittens, and she now laid down her work and smoothed those mittens. "I am going, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, "to marry Tom Gradgrind's daughter." "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Sparset. "I hope you may be happy, Mr. Bounderby." "Oh, indeed, I hope you may be happy, sir." And she said it with such great condescension, as well as with such great compassion for him, that Bounderby, far more disconcerted than if she had thrown her work-box at the mirror, or swooned on the hearth-rug, corked up the smelling salts tight in his pocket, and thought, "Now confound this woman! Who could have ever guessed that she would take it in this way?" "I wish with all my heart, sir," said Mrs. Sparset in a highly superior manner. Somehow she seemed in a moment to have established a right to pity him ever afterwards, "that you may be in all respects very happy." "Well, ma'am," returned Bounderby, with some resentment in his tone, which was clearly lowered, though in spite of himself, "I am obliged to you. I hope I shall be." "Do you, sir?" said Mrs. Sparset, with great affability. "But naturally you do. Of course you do." A very awkward pause on Mr. Bounderby's part succeeded. Mrs. Sparset sedately resumed her work, and occasionally gave a small cough, which sounded like the cough of conscious strength and forbearance. "Well, ma'am," resumed Mr. Bounderby, "under these circumstances, I imagine it would not be agreeable to a character like yours to remain here, though you would be very welcome here." "Oh dear, no, sir. I could on no account think of that." Mrs. Sparset shook her head, still in her highly superior manner, and a little changed the small cough, coughing now as if the spirit of prophecy rose within her, but had better be coughed down. "However, ma'am," said Bounderby, "there are apartments at the Bank, where a born and bred lady, as keeper of the place would be rather a catch than otherwise, and if the same terms— I beg your pardon, sir? You were so good as to promise that you would always substitute the phrase annual compliment. Well, ma'am, annual compliment. If the same annual compliment would be acceptable there, why, I see nothing to part us unless you do. Sir, returned Mrs. Sparset, the proposal is like yourself, and if the position I shall assume at the bank is one that I could occupy without descending lower in the social scale— Why, of course it is, said Bounderby. If it was not, ma'am, you don't suppose that I should offer it to a lady who has moved in the society you have moved in? Not that I care for such society, you know, but you do. Mr. Bounderby, you are very considerate. You'll have your own private apartments, and you'll have your coals and your candles and all the rest of it, and you'll have your maid to attend upon you, and you'll have your light porter to protect you, and you'll be what I take the liberty of considering precious comfortable, said Bounderby. Sir, rejoined Mrs. Sparset, say no more. And yielding up my trust here, I shall not be freed from the necessity of eating the bread of dependence. She might have said the sweet bread, for the delicate article in a savoury brown sauce was her favourite supper, and I would rather receive it from your hand than from any other. Therefore, sir, I accept your offer gratefully and with many sincere acknowledgments for past favours. And I hope, sir, said Mrs. Sparset, concluding in an impressively compassionate manner, I fondly hope that Miss Gradgrind may be all you desire and deserve. Nothing moved Mrs. Sparset from that position any more. It was in vain for Bounderby to bluster or to assert himself in any of his explosive ways. Mrs. Sparset was resolved to have compassion on him as a victim. She was polite, obliging, cheerful, hopeful. But the more polite, the more obliging, the more cheerful, the more hopeful, the more exemplary altogether she, for the forlorner sacrifice and victim he, she had that tenderness for his melancholy fate, that his great red countenance used to break out into cold perspirations when she looked at him. Meanwhile, the marriage was appointed to be solemnized in 8 weeks' time, and Mr. Bounderby went every evening to Stone Lodge as an accepted wooer. Love was made on these occasions in the form of bracelets, and on all occasions during the period of betrothal took a manufacturing aspect. Dresses were made, jewellery was made, cakes and gloves were made, settlements were made, and an extensive assortment of facts did appropriate honour to the contract. The business was all fact, from first to last. The hours did not go through any of those rosy performances which foolish poets have ascribed to them at such time. Neither did the clocks go any faster or any slower than at other seasons. The deadly statistical recorder in the Gradgrind observatory knocked every second on the head as it was born, and buried it with his accustomed regularity. So the day came, as all other days come to people who will only stick to reason, and, when it came, there were married in the church of the florid wooden legs, that popular order of architecture, Josiah Bounderby, Esquire, of Coketown, to Louisa, eldest daughter of Thomas Gradgrind, Esquire, of Stone Lodge, M.P. for that borough. And when they were united in holy matrimony, they went home to breakfast to Stone Lodge aforesaid. There was an improving party assembled on the auspicious occasion, who knew what everything they had to eat and drink was made of, and how it was imported or exported, and in what quantities, and in what bottoms, whether native or foreign, and all about it. The bridesmaids, down to little Jane Gradgrind, were, in an intellectual point of view, fit helpmates for the calculating boy, and there was no nonsense about any of the company. After breakfast, the bridegroom addressed them in the following terms: "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Since you have done my wife and myself the honour of drinking our healths and happiness, I suppose I must acknowledge the same, though as you all know me and know what I am and what my extraction was, you won't expect a speech from a man who, when he sees a post, says, 'That's a post,' and when he sees a pump, says, 'That's a pump,' and is not to be got to call a post a pump, or a pump a post, or either of them a toothpick. If you want a speech this morning, my friend and father-in-law, Tom Gradgrind, is a member of Parliament, and you know where to get it. I am not your man. However, if I feel a little independent when I look around this table today and reflect how little I thought of marrying Tom Gradgrind's daughter when I was a ragged street boy who never washed his face unless it was at a pump, and that's not oftener than once a fortnight, I hope I may be excused. So, I hope you like my feeling independent. If you don't, I can't help it. I do feel independent. Now, I have mentioned, and you have mentioned, that I am this day married to Tom Gradgrind's daughter. I'm very glad to be so. It has long been my wish to be so. I've watched her bringing up, and I believe she is worthy of me. At the same time, not to deceive you, I believe I am worthy of her. So I thank you on both our parts for the good will you have shown towards us, and the best wish I can give the unmarried part of the present company is this: I hope every bachelor may find as good a wife as I have found, and I hope every spinster may find as good a husband as my wife has found." Shortly after which oration, as they were going on a nuptial trip to Lyon, in order that Mr. Bounderby might take the opportunity of seeing how the hands got on in those parts, and whether they, too, required to be fed with gold spoons, the happy pair departed for the railroad. The bride, in passing downstairs, dressed for her journey, found Tom waiting for her, flushed, either with his feeling or the vinous part of the breakfast. "What a game girl you are, to be such a first-rate sister, Lou," whispered Tom. She clung to him, as she could have clung to some far better nature that day, and was a little shaken in her reserved composure for the first time. "Old Bounderby's quite ready," said Tom. "Time's up. Good-bye. I shall be on the lookout for you when you come back. I say, my dear Lou, ain't it uncommonly jolly now?" End of Section 8 of Hard Times.